Hey, what's up? It's Cute What If this side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku becomes monster. Now before we move ahead with the fic, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. They followed Inko into one of the larger dens amongst the canopy of the trees. From there, they sat in a circle. Inko was in the back of the den, with the general to her right. Izuku sat across from his mother, with Hitoshi and Shadow on his right and left respectively. Only a few moments passed before Inko started. Currently, we are in a large pocket dimension located at the top of the tallest tree in Aokigahara. She let that information sit for a moment. Izuku perked up, so when we shadow traveled at the Musutafu forest we were throwing anyone who may be following us off our track, he asked. Inko nodded, proud of her son for that correct deduction. She waited another moment, before continuing. She gestured to everyone in the room, are called Khans. She then pointed at Izuku. You, my son, are what's known as a Khanivore. Izuku tilted his head in question, and Ko responded in kind. Now, you are only the second one to exist, but the last one was the same as you. The apex of our species, and the only one who can transform humans into Khans. Izuku SCK in a breath. That made so much sense. He nodded, and gestured for his mom to continue. And Ko did. Khans are a form of demon, and we have been around for over 1,000 years. Izuku nodded intently. Being born a Khan is different, of course. All Khans have an instinctual SDSM built into their genetics, because Khans need to kill to eat. So this abolishes useless things like guilt. Hitoshi gently pawed at the floor. That makes a lot of sense. And Ko nodded, agreeing with him. It does, doesn't it? A pause. For many years I believed that Izuku didn't get the sadistic nature of a Khan. Only now do I realize that you've been suppressing it for many years, she told Izuku, who looked to be trying to process the sheer amount of information. He blinked a few times, before adding on, I was so determined to become a hero, that I didn't even stop to consider why and how I felt this way. He tilted his head to one side, suddenly remembering something. Maybe the cat should have clued me in. And Ko blinked. The cat. Izuku, startled that he had said that out loud. Yeah, when I was like 12, and I was walking home from school, there was an injured cat in an alleyway. Something, probably hunger, looking back at it, came over me, and next thing I knew, I had drained the cat of its BLD. He chuckled sheepishly. I mostly just didn't acknowledge that it happened. That makes sense, said Vanira. When everyone's eyes went to her, she elaborated. Our queen is known for conveniently ignoring things too. And Ko playfully nipped at Vanira, who gave a laugh. Izuku let them have their moment, before saying, if I'm to lead this revolution, I need to know what our plan is. So they spent the next few hours planning, until finally, they came up with a concrete plan, with fallback plans as well. Identity of Soul Stealer revealed to be that of high school student Midoriya Izuku. Katsuki sat there, shock overriding his other bodily functions, eyes locked to the screen. There was the picture under the headline of the familiar face that he's been trying so hard to mend his relationship with. He shook, clenching his fist in an emotion he couldn't put a name to. Anger, terror, betrayal, a mix of those three. No, Katsuki thought, this is some sort of cruel mix-up. Katsuki suddenly stood up, knocking over a fake plant with a swipe of his hand. He let out a frustrated yell that sounded more choked than he cared to admit. His classmates around him seemed to be in a similar state of mind, though the only one who was in the same degree of shock as Katsuki was Kirishima. Katsuki watched as the red-haired boy clutched his head and yelled out, that FCK traitor. Katsuki only barely caught the mutters from the boy. Already used to the mutters of Izu, he caught himself. The two of them just stood there, smiling, like both of them weren't serial killers. It wasn't like him, but Katsuki went over and tentatively gave his friend a hug, cutting off his mutters instantly. Against his will, small tears escaped Katsuki's eyes before he could stop them. This undoubtedly alarmed his classmates around him. The news on the TV changed to the carnage of downtown Musutafu. Hundreds were dead, buildings were decimated, and it was all thanks to 3 giant creatures. The largest one being the same creature at the USJ. There was never a doppelganger of Izuku. It was all an elaborate ploy to keep his cover. Katsuki's knees buckled, and it was only Kirishima that kept him from hitting the ground too hard. The tears were flowing now, as reality hit Katsuki in the face like a freight train. Was this his fault? That nerd had to endure years of never-ending bullying and torment thanks to the blonde. Was he part of the reason that he became a villain? He recalled the memories he fought so hard to push down, back at the USJ. Izuku had obviously been in a disguise. He ducked his head and grit his teeth as he remembered how the nerd had taunted him, gloating about how he had killed his lackeys, and brutally, at that. Then he remembered how he had threatened to RP him. It had been an awful feeling, and he had felt so useless. When had Izuku ever been so goddamned evil? Had he merely hid it well? Or did something happen to change him? Katsuki didn't know, but he was going to find out. Nezu was fascinated by this interesting revelation. Who would have thought that Tsukachi-kun's quirkless understudy was Japan's most wanted supervillain? And a Khan to boot. Nezu hadn't heard a word from a Khan in decades. He thought they had all died off during the rise of quirks. Obviously not, though he has never seen a Khan so powerful. It's a wonder how High-Specs didn't make the connection sooner. He just never would have thought that they'd have a Khan on their hands. Nezu hopped down from his chair and began preparations. Preparations for what, you may ask? War. A few days later, Izuku sat with the entirety of the League of Villains in the living room of their base. All of their moles were there, including Aoyama, who had been a mole for one. His eyes had practically bugged out of their head when they saw the 5 other UA student moles. Well, 2 now. Mess Amy's, this is quite unexpected. He laughed nervously as Izuku slunk over to him, ducking behind his back and out of his sight momentarily. This caused chills to go up the blonde's spine. Izuku went back to the center of the room and held out his hands, signaling the idle chatter to quiet. Welcome friends, foes, and non-binary hoes. That earned him a few chuckles, lowering the tension in the room. I have gathered all of you here today to inform you all that our plans will be set into motion. He whipped his head to look in the back doorway of the room. Dabai, said man had his attention focused on him. I need you to do some scouting for cannon fodder. Dabai nodded his head, and Izuku turned to Tamura. Shigi, I'd like you to make an alliance with Chisaki Kai, former leader of the Shai Hasekai. Their quirk eliminating operation was shut down by the police, but there's still a fair amount of power to be had with them. Tamura nodded. Izuku turned to Toga. I have some BLD of a police officer. Toga, I need you to gather intel at the police station now that I'm not there. She nodded. Izuku continued to assign roles, and soon enough, everybody had a role. He clapped his hands together with a smile on his face as he finished. Everyone dispersed, including the boys, who went up to Izuku's room with him. When they got there, Izuku put a hand on both his boys' shoulders, turned the 3 of them to shadow, and whisked them away. They reappeared in an alleyway, close to the main area of Chiba nightlife, a place relatively undisturbed by Izuku's reign of terror. That would change. Izuku changed his hair color to black, and his eyes to red. It would keep people from recognizing him on the spot. The other 2 changed their appearances similarly. Izuku pulled them out of the alley and into a nearby nightclub. The music was blaring, and the crowd was endless. Hitoshi and Shadow acted as if they were Izuku's bodyguards, and the crowd around them realized it. Getting up to the bar, Izuku slid into a seat. His boyfriends on either side of him. Izuku watched as the bartender side-eyed them, looking from the news playing on the TV playing above the bar to back at the boys. She did this multiple times, before picking up the phone and whispering quietly into the receiver. Izuku bet she thought he couldn't hear her. This is exactly what he wanted. Yes police, I think there's a serial killer in my bar at 40 Cent. Chiba Prefecture. Send heroes. The bartender choked as BLD rushed up her throat and into her mouth, blocking what she was going to say. Frozen, she looked down to see an arm through her abdomen. An arm that was pulled out, letting BLD gush onto the floor as the owner of said arm had the BLD clean from his fingers. She tried to scream, but it was no use. Her vocal cords were against her. A couple patrons of the bar started to take notice, and eventually one of them screamed. This caused a chain reaction that spread throughout the club. No one reacted at first, thinking it was just part of the fun. But then the scream became blood-curdling. The music kept going, heedless of the monstrosity beneath it. The crowd was in chaos. Shadow got up from his chair and lunged at one of the patrons, ripping their throat out with his teeth. This prompted more screaming. Hitoshi made his way to the door of the club, blocking the rest of the guests from leaving. A few of them already escaped, but there was no helping that. Hitoshi grinned sadistically at some of the patrons, relishing in the way they scrambled to get away from him. His eyes glowed magenta, alerting most people in the club as to what exactly they were dealing with. Even more people screamed. Izuku started to laugh, gaining the attention of everyone around him. He turned his hair back to green, and his eyes stayed red. Surrounded on all sides, the crowd behaved like a herd of sheep surrounded by a pack of wolves. That was when the heroes got there. Izuku could see the palpable relief on everyone's faces. Yet his eyes lit up as the crowd grew complacent. He grabbed onto a nearby person, and grew enough to bite off the person's head in one go. Panic grew again, but this time he didn't stop. He kept tearing through person after person, cutting down the crowd size as mutilated bodies dropped to the floor. The screaming of the people was tuned out by the sound of his demented laughter. A hero, Firelight, and her sidekick were standing in the doorway of the club. They were frozen in place, no doubt having never experienced something like this before. Such a shame. Got here too late, did you? He taunted the hero. Firelight just clenched her fists by her sides, obviously holding back from spewing insults, especially to a well-known serial killer. She held her head up high and said righteously, "You will never get away with this villain." Izuku snorted. Really? That's it? You think that's the first time I've heard that phrase? You're so naive, hero. Firelight flinched back, but stood her ground. Izuku smiled at that. He had his lips and had BLD running down his chin. Firelight lit her hands on fire and stepped forward to face Izuku. She had a look of determination on her face, even as she was sweating from the heat of her flames. It was the obvious downside of her quirk. She stepped forward, through the threshold of the bar, before all hell broke loose. Izuku vaulted himself over the counter, bowling over people in his wake as he rushed towards the hero. Her sidekick, Wick, stepped in front of her, taking the hit that was meant for Firelight. Wick smiled as pain erupted in her chest. She's glad she could buy her superior time to take down this villain. Izuku tilted his head to the side and mirrored her smile, except that it was out of malicious intent. Your actions are in vain. The smile grew wider as BLD erupted from her mouth, with the hand through her chest retreating back to Izuku's side. He had the viscera off his hand and stared down Firelight as her sidekick dropped dead to the floor. "Your turn," he spoke, before he sped toward the hero once again. Firelight dodged, sending flames at Izuku. The flames tore through his right side, mangling his arm. Izuku snarled, his face morphing. He bit the whole upper body of one of the crowd members, taking their heart in his teeth. He swallowed, and his arm rapidly healed like nothing even happened. Firelight didn't dwell on it though, and rushed him again. Izuku was prepared for the flames this time and swiftly dodged her arms, before swiveling around and elbowing her in the ribs. That move sent her to the floor, where she struggled to get up as the breath was roughly knocked from her lungs. Izuku didn't give her time to do anything but scream out in pain as he crushed her spine under his heel. He let out a loud, deranged laugh, and remembered why Hitoshi loved it so much. Speaking of Hitoshi, Izuku looked around for his boyfriends. He saw that both of them were doing crowd control. There weren't very many people left. The ones who were still alive were cowering in the corner, with Shadow and Hitoshi stalking toward them. Izuku resumed toying with the hero. All that determination was replaced with broken sobs. He pulled in her hair, lifting her up, before smashing her head back onto the ground, knocking her out. He leaned down and gouged out her heart, growing into himself and devouring the rest of her. He joined Shadow and Hitoshi, who had just finished off the last of the victims. They all could hear police sirens, so they took off into the shadows, leaving the carnage behind. When Naomasa got there, it was a bloodbath. Bodies strewn everywhere, some decapitated, some stabbed, and others were missing their whole upper bodies. It was sickening. He knew Izuku was behind this, and couldn't help but clench his fists in despair. He quickly barked orders to his officers, rounding up the dead and trying to find any survivors. There were none. Naomasa refused to show emotion, especially here on the street. He could save the breakdown for when he got home. That didn't stop his shoulders from shaking uncontrollably, nor his eyes from tearing up slightly. The feelings he held for Izuku wouldn't go away so quickly. Naomasa viewed Izuku as his son. Naomasa choked, unable to keep the tears at bay. His subordinates saw and suggested that he go home. They would take care of the paperwork. He just nodded and made his way back. When he made it back, he made a cup of tea for himself. As he was letting it cool off, he got on his pajamas and went to sit on his couch with his tea. The tears were flowing, and he let them. He sipped his tea, letting the warmth of it calm him. It only helped a little, but it was something. He thought about when Aizawa came up to him. He'd initially laughed at such a concept. Izuku, an informant. It had seemed ridiculous. That is, until he'd seen Izuku's face. The darkening of his eyes, and the smile on his face that just got wider and wider. Then he had said it. "The soul stealer," he mumbled aloud. His eyes were blank, even as he thought of the denial he felt at the beginning. He put his cup on the coffee table and laid down on the couch, letting the depression sink into him. In the middle of the morning at Aldera High, Izuku slipped out of the shadows and into the halls. There was only one person in the hallway, as everyone else was in class. It was Takahira. He was getting books out of his locker and looking at his phone. "Ni, Takahira-san," Izuku called out. Said boy violently startled at the sound of his voice. He whipped around to look at Izuku, eyeing his extra features. "Quirkless-sama, what an unexpected visit. What are you doing here, if I may ask?" Izuku's smile was all teeth. "I'm just dropping in to say hi to my classmates and teachers." Takahira didn't look particularly surprised. He smiled to himself at the thought of terrorizing everyone. Too bad he wasn't in Quirkless's class. "Well, I'm off," Izuku said, turning around and waving bye to Takahira as he made his way toward his classroom. Stopping right outside the door, he could hear his teacher lecturing about something. He knocked on the door lightly, enough that the teacher stopped talking. Who is it?" Izuku smiled as he kicked the door in. It landed on the floor, and he was privy to the horrified faces of his former classmates. Some of the students looked ready to bolt, even though Izuku was blocking the only door out of the room. We don't want any murders ... yet." Izuku's smile widened and his eyes widened. The students shrank away from him. Midoriya. His head whipped around to stare at the teacher, who was doing her best not to cower. "She failed. Why did you become a V-villain?" She stumbled. Izuku's smile widened to horrifying degrees. "Why not? I couldn't be a hero, and being a villain is so much more fun. No morals to hold you down." He cackled. And the scared, pitiful look on everyone's faces is priceless as they're about to die. Izuku pulled out his phone and decided to call Shadow. Pressing the call button, he happily put the phone to his ear. "Izuku, what is it?" Izuku giggled. "Shu, my dear, I need your help with something. Do you think you could step in here for a moment?" he asked. The class in front of him sat petrified. It took a few moments, but eventually, Shadow stepped out of the shadows. He went up to Izuku and pressed a chaos on his head. Izuku looked at Shadow with a small smile on his face, whispering into his ear, "Shaochan, can you make sure no one escapes? If they try, they're yours." Shadow nodded, returning the smile. Turning his attention back to the class, Izuku smiled at them. It was a cute, innocent smile. In a split second, it changed to being menacingly, but it only lasted a second before he blurred out of sight. One of the kids in the middle of the group suddenly started choking. His throat was slit. Upon noticing this, the rest of the class started freaking out, but no one made any moves yet. It was when a few more kids started dropping that people started standing up from their seats. BLD pooled on the floor, staining everyone's feet red. Izuku lifted his hands at eye level, closing his fists as he blinked. The shadows of the room started reforming into something monstrous. They warped before coalescing to where Izuku stood. Izuku spread out his hands, causing the shadows to wrap around the throats of the students, aside from those with their throats slit. Those kids had shadows wrapped around the entirety of them. The reason for this became obvious as the shadows squeezed the bodies of the dying students, causing BLD to spurt out of their mouths like a fountain. The trapped students in the vicinity could do nothing as the shadows around their throats kept them open so the spraying BLD could fill up their lungs. He knew his idea worked when some of the students' GG reflexes kicked in. They were coughing and hacking, but it was no use as more BLD kept pooling. This method of torture, death only dealt with about half the class. The other half of the class had to just sit and watch. When the others were dead, Izuku turned his gaze toward them. One of them bolted to the window, struggling to unlock it. That's when Shadow stepped in. He lunged at the kid, tearing his head off in one go. It was this kill that cemented the fact to the other students. They were most certainly going to die. They started screaming, alerting other classrooms around the school. Izuku cursed, before darting toward the group and taking out as many as he could in one blow. Shadow didn't linger on that one student, instead doing the same thing as Izuku. Now that they were in a time crunch, Shadow was about to go after the teacher, when Izuku stopped him with a sideways glance. Let her live. I want to send my message, after all. He gave her a cocky smirk. Tell Naomasa-kun to surrender himself to me. He glanced at the doorway, before his eyes slid their way back to her, or I'll kill everyone in Musutafu. One at a time. By the time the police got there, the two villains were long gone, and all that was left was 25 dead students and one terrified teacher. Naomasa had fallen asleep on the couch, having cried himself to sleep. The call woke him up. It had surprised him and he had fallen off the couch. He ran to get his phone. Now holding it, he found it was his precinct. Must be serious, he mumbled. Upon pressing the button, Sansa's voice was yelling in his ear. Tsukachi-kun, this is bad. Quirkless has it out for you. Naomasa almost dropped the phone. He killed a class of high schoolers barely an hour ago. But he left someone alive. The teacher, and he gave her a message. Naomasa faltered. He'd never left someone alive before. What is the message? On the other side, Sansa sounded choked, like he was trying not to cry. It was tell Naomasa-kun to surrender himself to me, or I'll kill everyone in Musutafu. He didn't say anything else. Naomasa felt a pit of dread for him. He was given a choice, but it was an obvious choice. Naomasa is one man, and Musutafu has thousands of people. He won't sacrifice that many for his own safety. Looking down on his phone, the call was still open. Sansa-kun, surrender me to him. I've already made my choice. That was the last straw for Sansa, who started wailing over the phone. Naomasa held it away from his ear at the loud sound. Sansa protested, the whole station did. They wanted to get everyone out of Musutafu. Evacuate the city. Though Naomasa was touched by how far they'd go, he knew it was eventually going to happen. Izuku getting a hold of him. He talked them out of it, and instead got up to go put his work clothes on, trench coat included. He drove to the station, and stood out front as his coworkers and friends fussed over him. Many if not all of them were crying. He told them it would be okay. Eventually they said their goodbyes, and went back to the station, where they had set up others with guns directed at Naomasa. This was a chance to catch the soul stealer and they weren't going to waste it. Minutes passed. Nothing. About an hour passed. That's when Naomasa took out his phone. Texting Izuku's number, he typed, 7:46 p.m. Masa-kun, Izuku, I'm outside the station, surrendering myself to you. 7:46 p.m. Izuku-kun, oh this is fun. Didn't think I'd get you so soon. Thought you might need a little convincing. As soon as the message was sent, the lights in the parking lot started violently furring. The shadows grew, stretching and bending themselves toward Naomasa. The men in the precinct were tense with their guns raised. Naomasa held his breath as the shadows coalesced around himself. In his ear he heard, nice try Masa-kun, but I'm just here for you. Naomasa whipped around trying to fling the shadows off of him somehow. The action only made the shadows wrap tighter around him. He took a gasping breath of air as he melted into Izuku's shadows, disappearing from the front of the station. When Naomasa woke up, when had he fallen asleep, he found that he was tied to a chair in what looked to be a cellar. There were rogue shadows dancing along the walls. Coming from the shadows was unintelligible whispering. Only a few minutes passed before the shadows made their way in front of Naomasa's chair. They grew and coalesced into Izuku himself. Izuku gave a happy smile that was inches away from Naomasa's face. The detective tried to lean away, but his face was harshly grabbed and pulled back forward. Suddenly, Izuku let go and stepped back, clapping his hands together joyously. Masa-kun, I missed you. How long has it been? He put his hand on his chin like he was contemplating. 3 days. That's too long in my opinion. He gave a soft laugh that'd be cute in any other context. Naomasa struggled in his restraints. Izuku-kun, what joy do you get from faking a friendship with me? He asked. The tears were making a comeback. The smile Izuku gave him this time was sad. That's the fun part about all of this, Masa. Most of it was real. Somehow that just made everything worse. So why am I even here? Naomasa asked. Izuku circled his chair as he asked. This action made Naomasa nervous. What was he doing? This was the most notorious supervillain in Japan, if not the continent. Why would he presume to know what Izuku was thinking? Izuku hummed some nameless melody as he went off to the side and picked something up. Going around behind him, Izuku put a blndfld on Naomasa. The material was scratchy, slightly digging into his skin. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Izuku walked out of the room and came back shortly. He was carrying something, though Naomasa couldn't tell what it was. Soon Izuku went up to him, hand behind his back, with the other plugging his nose. Eat up, he said, as he placed something up to Naomasa's mouth. Said man closed his lips and refused to eat whatever was given to him. Izuku tossed and lightly slapped his face. Don't you want some food, Masa-kun? The way he emphasized food made Naomasa wary. He turned his head to the side and refused to open his mouth. Not having the patience for this, Izuku let go of his nose and manually opened his mouth, shoving whatever he was holding in. The taste of iron flooded Naomasa's tongue as he was forced to swallow something fleshy down his throat, whatever it was. Naomasa had a sinking suspicion. He just hoped that he was wrong. See, that wasn't so hard, now was it? He obviously wasn't expecting an answer and instead took the blndfld off. Naomasa was still tasting the BLD that he swallowed. Looking up, the man saw that Izuku was holding a still beating heart in hand. Naomasa let out a choked sob as he tried to get the BLD out of his mouth. A hand on his throat stopped him. Ah, no takesies backsies. He held the heart up to the detective's face again. Come on, just one more bite. Then you won't have to eat anymore, he said. Naomasa didn't open his mouth, but he also didn't stop Izuku from shoving the heart into his mouth again. He got a larger piece this time, and gagged as it went down his throat. The hand that was still on his throat helped push it down. Once down, Naomasa slumped in his chair, breathing heavily. Izuku took his hand off his throat. He took the heart in his hand and unhinged his jaw, swallowing it whole. Not much changed except that Izuku grew a few inches. Why did you give me a heart? Is it some weird initiation or something? Naomasa asked. Izuku tilted his head and giggled, but didn't explain. Instead, he left the room. Naomasa waited for him to come back. He sat waiting, no food, no water, for 2 days. Did he mean the no food thing literally? When Izuku finally came back, he dragged along a crying man with him. Naomasa didn't recognize him, but it didn't really matter. He was so hungry that it hurt. From his pocket, Izuku grabbed a vial of what looked to be BLD. Masa-kun, I got you a present. He uncorked the vial and held it to the detective's lips. Before the man could even think to pull away, Izuku pushed his forehead back and poured the BLD down his throat. As soon as it was all swallowed, Naomasa felt something inside him shift. It wasn't painful, but it wasn't exactly comfortable. He let his head drop as he let the feeling pass. What did you do? Untying him, Izuku sing-songed, I gave you an upgrade, Masa-kun, and I was even nice enough to bring you some food. An upgrade? What did he mean? Naomasa froze. No. He turned to gaze in horror at the crying man on the ground, being held down by Izuku's foot. Something in the back of his mind compelled him to eat. To feast. He gripped his head with his newly untied hands. No, he said, I refuse. Izuku gave a light laugh. No can do, Masa-kun. Wanna know what happened when I refused to eat? He smiled, getting closer to Naomasa's face. I snapped and killed my own teacher. It's inevitable. He leaned back, standing up straight, with each arm extended out on either side of him. Then, I became the most wanted supervillain in Japan. Isn't that wonderful, Masa-kun? Izuku gave a small frown when he saw that Naomasa wasn't as excited as he was. He'd need to change that. How about this, Masa-kun? His hand morphed into a claw, and he took a swipe at the crying man's throat, making BLD spew. The man on the ground was struggling to scream. Naomasa leaned forward, towards the man. He jerked backwards, whipping his head away from the gruesome scene, even though his mouth was watering. The aroma of BLD wafted up from the body. It reached his nose. That's when Naomasa couldn't hold himself back. His eyes dilated, and he dove from the chair and onto the dying man's throat, SCK up as much BLD as he could. To him, it was both delightful and horrifying. He couldn't get enough, yet all he wanted to do was stop. He was about to lift up and get away from the body before Izuku pushed his head back down to the man's chest. Naomasa couldn't make himself stop as he tore open the man's chest with his teeth, prompting a scream that grated on his ears. The taste of flesh on his tongue was like ambrosia, and he hated it. He felt his own body shifting, and he knew he was shifting into the same creatures as the others. It was sickening. Above him, Izuku laughed maniacally. That's it, Masa-kun. Now you're getting it. He carefully let up his foot and smiled when Naomasa kept eating. Without making too much noise, he walked out of the room and locked the door behind him. Going to the security room, he found Dabai sitting in the main chair. Was wondering how you did it to Shu, Dabai said. Izuku was on edge, and, now that you know. Dabai quickly held up his hands. Whoa, calm down, boss. It was just curiosity. I'll get out of your hair now. Izuku relaxed. Dabai didn't move from his spot, but Izuku didn't really care. He went up to the desk and looked at the screen connected to the cellar. Naomasa was still eating, and he didn't look to be stopping anytime soon. Izuku saw that the man's trench coat stayed intact surprisingly, though jagged spikes poked out the back of it. Once the man found the heart, it was interesting to see. Izuku saw as he grabbed it with serrated claws, but he didn't open his mouth right away. Instead he set it back into the cest, before circling the body a few times. He stopped near the back of the room, vigorously shaking his head. It seems he still had some resistance. Izuku was about to go help him, but stopped when Naomasa suddenly lunged at the heart, snapping it in his jaws at near lightning speed. He grew slightly larger, before going to the corner of the room and curling up. The door behind them opened. Looking over his shoulder, Izuku saw that it was Hitoshi. He went to look at the screen of the cellar, and did a double take. "Wait, who is that? You made another one?" he asked. Izuku gave a bright smile, holding up a peace sign. "Yup, it's my Masa-kun." Hitoshi choked out a laugh. "Masa? You mean Tsukachi Naomasa, the lead detective on your case." Beside them, Dabai choked, coughing a bit. "Geez boss, didn't know you could make more power moves than you already have," he said. Izuku laughed lightly. "Yeah, I guess you could see it as a power move. I just saw it as collecting what's mine." Dabai facepalmed. It had been about 4 days since Detective Tsukachi was taken, and Sansa was worried. What was Midoriya going to do with him? Torture him for information? That'd be useless since he already knows everything they know, being Tsukachi's former understudy. Torture him in general. They wouldn't put it past a supervillain who's known for doing that to people. The only other thing Sansa could think of was using him as a trophy, like a sort of FCKU to the precinct and the heroes. Would they send his body back in pieces, or in scattered pieces for them to find? Would they find their beloved detective crucified on the front of the station? Sansa doesn't know if they could take that. To be fair, their situation was screwed either way. Sure, Nezu had something planned, but that was for the heroes, not the police. As he was contemplating the situation, one of the other officers ran into the office. "Sansa, the detective is outside the station," he cried. Sansa hurriedly stood from his chair, and ran out to see Detective Tsukachi standing in the parking lot. His clothes and trench coat were torn, and he was hunched over, not looking at them, but instead staring at the ground. His eyes were shadowed, and his aura was different. Something wasn't right. Multiple officers were approaching him, some greeting him and some asking if he was okay. Tsukachi didn't respond to any of them, and instead stayed quiet. What did they do to him? That question was answered when one of the men got within reaching distance of him. Tsukachi's eyes snapped up, a bright, cobalt blue unlike his usual black ones. He swiped his arm, too fast for most of them to see. The man in front of him screamed, spewing BLD from his mouth as he fell to the ground. His throat was cut. The other officers were immediately on guard. A small grimace appeared on his face. He opened his mouth and shouted, "Run! Get away from me!" Sansa took a few steps back, and saw some others do the same as well. Some of the more block-headed officers took out their guns and aimed at Tsukachi. Said man blurred from sight, moving faster than he'd ever moved, and each of the approaching officers suddenly had their heads removed from their bodies. Tsukachi gripped his head with bloodied hands and yelled out. His eyes were crazed, yet there were tears falling. Instead of going after the others, Tsukachi bent down to the fallen officers and started eating them. "Naomasa," someone shouted, "what the hell are you doing?" Looking off to the side, Sansa saw All Might getting out of a car. Tsukachi didn't acknowledge him, and instead kept eating. Somehow, it got worse. Tsukachi started shifting, growing extra joints in his extremities. His face lengthened into a sharp bone maw. Soon they were all looking at the same creature as the Soul Stealer. "They can multiply." Sansa started barking orders to the other officers. "Contact as many heroes as you can. We need to get him into custody." He looked over to All Might, who was frozen in his place. Tsukachi suddenly stopped, transformed back slightly, and scrambled away from the bodies in apparent horror. He looked to the side, making eye contact with All Might. Eyes widening, he yelled, "Toshinori, get out of here. He's coming." All Might stumbled back. "Who?" That question was answered for him when a laugh echoed around the parking lot. It was a maniacal laugh. When the shadows started warping, that's when Sansa knew. The Soul Stealer had arrived. "All Might," said man whipped around to look behind him, only to find nothing. "Your heart is finally mine." All Might dove forward, and that was the only thing that saved him from being stabbed. The boy that was standing there was Midoriya, Tsukachi's former understudy. Sansa had heard what happened, though he hadn't quite believed it. But here, right now, there was no doubt. Midoriya Izuku and the Soul Stealer were one and the same. Midoriya pouted cutely, before a manic grin overtook his face as he shot forward. All Might tried dodging again, but failed, and ended up being stabbed in the abdomen, right on his wound. BLD spurted from his mouth, and he let out a choked cry. "Goodbye, Yagi Toshinori," Midoriya said as he reached into the symbol of peace's cest, pulling out a barely beating heart, and dropping it into his mouth. Instead of immediately swallowing, Midoriya merely chewed, as though he were savoring the flavor. As he swallowed, his aura changed. The husk of a man fell to the ground with a deafening thump. It was done. All Might was dead. The heroes arrived to a bloodied detective, the Soul Stealer, and the corpse of All Might. Izuku leapt out of the way as Maruko launched in his direction with a flying kick. Yuzujiyama Rumi. We finally meet. The hero leapt after him like a bullet. The two of them ricocheted along buildings. If you think that's gonna throw me off, then you're sadly mistaken. In response, Izuku gave a childlike laugh as he jumped away from the lot. Maruko jumped after him. Not a second later, she caught up to him in the air. He turned and punched her in the stomach. The rabbit hero was launched back, and Izuku landed on the side of a building. She flipped and landed on her feet, a mere 50 feet away. They stared at each other for a brief moment, before Izuku launched the direction of another building, with Maruko following. The two of them ricocheted off all the buildings around the block of the station parking lot. When Izuku would try to go outside of that range, Maruko would throw him off his path and direct him back. Izuku started taunting her, making some fox and rabbit metaphors, bashing heroes in general. But Maruko was not falling for it like other heroes do. He started running out of things to taunt her with, including her family. He started panicking a little bit. Mid-leap, Izuku hopped into the shadow of a light post, disappearing from sight. Reappearing a visible block away, Izuku smirked at Maruko, and transformed. He was about 5 stories tall, easily dwarfing the hero. Maruko didn't flinch when a gust of wind blew past her as Mount Lady launched herself at Quirklash from off to the side. Quirklash took the hit, feeling an odd sense of déjà vu. He was pushed back but didn't let Mount Lady take advantage of that. He leapt towards Maruko, intent on snapping her in his jaws. Maruko moved out of the way before he could do that. Mount Lady followed behind him, trying to tackle him. Quirklash tore his way through buildings, leaving debris in his wake. This threw off Maruko, who had to watch where she jumped. Mount Lady had to go around the buildings, still making sure not to step on civilians. Before Quirklash could make his escape, he was blindsided by Kamui Woods, who had covered his vision with his quirk. This made Quirklash stumble, and it was deliberate to destroy more of the city. Tearing the hero off him, Quirklash roared at them, before doubling in size. As the fight went on, Kamui went back to where the detective was. Endeavor was in a defensive position facing Tsukachi, who was on the ground crying. Several police officers had their guns aimed at him, and were hesitant in doing so. This was their superior after all. Please, he cried, put a muzzle on me so I can't hurt anyone else. The officers looked at each other before one of them nodded, running back to the station to get one. Upon coming back, several officers argued about who'd be the one to do it. That's when Endeavor stepped up. I'll do it, he said, taking the muzzle in hand. Carefully walking up to Tsukachi, Endeavor held out the muzzle to put on Tsukachi's face. His face morphed, growing and shrinking at a rapid pace. He screamed at himself, gripping his head until his face shifted back to normal. Slowly looking up, Tsukachi took the muzzle in his hands and put it on his face himself. He lowered his head, continuing to cry. He was a monster, a literal monster. Tsukachi, Endeavor said. The crying man looked up at the hero, tilting his head, indicating that he was listening. We're going to take you back to UA. Nezu needs to see this. Tsukachi nodded, understanding what needed to be done. Though the word gentle wasn't in Endeavor's repertoire, he tried his best with the corrupted detective. Putting him in the backseat of his police car, Tsukachi's eyes faded back to black. At that time, Maruko returned. Quirklash escaped into the shadows. Looking around, she asked, "Where's Tsukachi-san?" Endeavor pointed to the man's own car, which he was in the backseat of. Maruko nodded, her face grim. I see. I'll meet you guys back at UA. With that, she shot off in the direction of the school. Soon, the rest of the heroes followed. Upon arriving at UA, Naomasa was led out of the car by a cautious Endeavor. As they opened the gates, they were greeted by the faculty plus Maruko. Naomasa saw the moment that Aizawa comprehended what he was seeing, because the man looked like he'd been slapped. As they passed the heroes, Naomasa tilted his head in a follow-me gesture. They went straight to Nezu's office. Upon opening the door, the stoat looked up, his hackles rising. Ah, Naomasa-kun, so you've been turned into a con. Interesting. He sipped his tea. Sit down, stay a while. We need to know what happened. Naomasa took a seat across from Nezu, while the other heroes stood on guard in case things got violent. Those present were most of the UA staff. They trusted the detective with their lives, but not like this. Naomasa reached up and undid the straps on the muzzle. Slowly lowering it, he held his breath. When nothing happened, he let out a relieved sigh. Holding it in his hands, he set the muzzle in his lap, ready to put it back on if necessary. He looked up at the smiling stoat, taking a deep breath. You know what I am? He asked. Nezu smiled. Yes. A con. A demonic species from the old days. I thought they went extinct, but obviously, I was wrong. Setting down his teacup, the smile was wiped from his face in an instant. This is bad, now that we have a con that can turn others into con. Who knows how many more the Soul Stealer can make? Midoriya Izuku, correct. Naomasa nodded. I need you to tell me what happened. So Naomasa did. 5 days ago, he killed a class of high schoolers. It was his own class, I believe. Leaving the teacher alive, which he's never done, he gave her a message to the station. Surrender Naomasa to me or I'll kill everyone in Musutafu. I knew the obvious choice, so I surrendered myself to him. He took another deep breath, holding back tears. He covered me in his shadows, taking me to the League of Villains base, presumably. I woke up tied to a chair in what looked to be a cellar. Some tears escaped his eyes. Izuku came in, and fed me a still beating heart. The others in the room startled at that, including Nezu. Naomasa gave a sad chuckle. Yeah, I know. It was disgusting. But then he left me there. No food, no water, for 2 days. He gripped the arms of the chair, splintering them. Catching himself, he lifted his hands from them and put them on the desk. Wincing, he apologized, then continued. When he came back, he was carrying a crying man by the scruff. I didn't recognize him, just assuming he was some low-level villain. He then took out a vial of BLD from his pocket. I had no idea whose BLD it was, but looking back, it was probably Izuku's BLD. He shivered, getting a chill. He put it to my mouth and pushed my head back. I had no choice but to swallow it. He paused, gauging how Nezu was reacting. With a solemn expression, he gestured for Naomasa to continue. I felt something inside me change then, and when I asked what happened, he said he gave me an upgrade. That's when I realized what had happened to me, because he had said a similar thing to me and Aizawa-kun when he talked about the power-up he gave Todoroki Shoto and Shinsu Hitoshi. I refused to go along with what he was trying to get me to do. That's when his hand morphed into a claw, slicing the man's throat, and he choked out a sob. I couldn't help it. He clapped a hand over his mouth, bending over on himself. Nezu let out a breath. I think that's enough for right now and no. I can do it, Naomasa interrupted as he sat back up. This is important. I'm not going to prolong this any more than I have to. Looking back at Aizawa, he continued, I went straight for the neck, and it was both delightful and horrifying. I honestly don't remember much after that, except for when I woke back up. The man's body was mangled, and his heart was missing. I knew I was responsible for it. Puffing a breath, he said, I think, after that, Izuku was testing me, trying to see how much I'd do under his command. Not much, mind you, he said as he saw the heroes tense. He apparently can only give general commands that I'd follow for a while, until I'd snap myself out of it. That's what he did for the rest of those 2 days, testing his limits. Earlier today, he transported me through the warp portal, with the instructions to attack and feast. He slumped, that's it, and you guys know the rest. Nezu sat back in his chair. I see. Thank you, Naomasa-kun. That's when Endeavor spoke. Tsukachi, back in the lot. Your eyes were blue, now they're not. Care to explain that? Naomasa blinked. They were. Interesting. He put his hand on his chin. Maybe it's similar to how Shinsu's eyes turned magenta. He concluded. All right, now that is settled, let's get right down to business. Would anyone like some tea? Naomasa nodded. Yes, I haven't had anything to drink in several days. Nezu got up to make some tea. Making a cup for himself, Naomasa, and Aizawa, who looked like he was ready to pass out. Once the tea was passed out, Nezu got down to business. Assuming Midoriya is the head of the League of Villains, which is unlikely, but not impossible, we need to figure out what assets he's going to use against us. So they planned. They utilized their resources to figure out how the League was going to attack the heroes. They never could have imagined the hell that will rain upon them. Bakugo Katsuki didn't know where to begin. Where did he start? Is it back in middle school? Farther back than that? Or was it more recent? Katsuki didn't know. At some point in the past year or so, the person Katsuki bullied had turned into a serial killer. How does one even start that? Gripping his head in frustration, he threw the pencil he was holding across his room. It clattered against the wall. Nothing was making sense anymore. Izuku was literally the sweetest person he knew in his life, but that didn't stop Katsuki from shoving him down at every turn. His regrets know no bounds. Even though his temper had been managed, Katsuki couldn't help but feel like he hadn't been trying hard enough to mend his relationship with Izuku. And now it had come to this. Suddenly, there was a knock on his door. He waited for one of the extras to announce their presence. No one did. Wary, because announcing their presence was a new protocol for Class 1A. Grabbing his phone, he dialed Aizawa-sensei. As the phone picked up, Katsuki spoke softly into the receiver. Someone's at the door. On the other end, he could hear Aizawa start running. Going up to his door and peering through the door hole, he saw nothing. Kaken. Whipping around, Katsuki looked at Izuku in betrayal and fear. Izuku was wearing a suit and fancy gloves. A wide smirk rested on his face, and his eyes leered at him. You, Katsuki started, you fucker. Letting off large explosions from his palms in Izuku's direction, Katsuki fumbled at the door, not taking his eyes off the villain. Finally, he got the door open, and nearly ran into Aizawa-sensei. The man, upon seeing Izuku, ushered Katsuki behind his back, so that he was in between his student and the monster in human skin. Izuku was slightly singed, but it's nothing he wasn't used to. Aizawa-kun, how nice of you to join us, Izuku said. Said man furrowed his brow. Midoriya, stop this. Izuku laughed in a crazed manner. No can do, Aizawa-kun. Said man glowered at Izuku. You can get off easier if you just surrender to us, he said. Izuku giggled again. What, so I can get 5 death sentences instead of 6? As the two conversed, Katsuki just watched with a horrible feeling in his gut. What happened to you, Izuku? Snapping his head in Katsuki's direction, Izuku's mouth downturned, his expression souring. He jumped up, attempting to kick Aizawa in the head. Blocking with his wrists, Aizawa cried out as one of them shattered. Aw, shame I didn't get your head. It would have been so much more delicious and fun with your skull bashed open. Bakugo let off an explosion in his direction. His eyes wide. Izuku wasn't just a serial killer, he was psychopathic. Izuku got a full face of the blast, and though his skin was thicker, Katsuki's explosions had gotten stronger. Once the smoke was cleared, Katsuki could see the burns marking his face. They were second-degree burns. But Izuku has had worse. He swung another kick into Aizawa's ribs, knocking the breath out of him. Turning to Katsuki with a snarl on his face, he disappeared from Katsuki's sight, and suddenly Katsuki was blacking out. Aizawa shot up and put himself between Izuku and Katsuki, refusing to let one of his students get taken again. His quirk was activated, but it did nothing to Izuku. Katsuki wasn't getting up, and Aizawa knew he was out cold. "If you want him, you'll have to get through me," Aizawa said. Izuku tilted his head, his smirk returning. "You're lucky I like you, Eraserhead." Izuku's form liquefied into shadow, absorbing himself into Aizawa's. The man himself jerked, but stood his ground, covering Katsuki's body. A scream tore its way out of Aizawa's throat as he was punched at the base of his spine, arching his body violently. He was weak on the ground for a few minutes, and by the time he looked back over to Katsuki, both him and Izuku were gone, practically vanished into thin air. Izuku watched with gleeful malice as Katsuki woke up bound in a chair. His hands were bound on the chair in quirk-canceling cuffs. His feet were bound as well as his midsection. He was still wearing the outfit he'd been wearing. Katsuki didn't want this creep touching him. As if sensing his thoughts, Izuku wrapped a hand around his throat, keeping him in place as he caressed Katsuki's face with his other hand. He ran his hands over Katsuki's sharp cheekbones, before grasping his chin so that he could look Izuku in the eyes. He was practically in Katsuki's lap, crouching on the armrests of the chair. "Your features are so defined, Kaken. By the time I'm done with you, they won't be able to recognize you." Somewhere in Katsuki's mind, he still regarded Izuku as the shy boy who wouldn't hurt a fly. The voice he had used was sweet, like he was making a silly little promise, instead of promising to disfigure him. "Maybe I'll start with your nose. I could cut your tendons and watch them fray and bleed down your face. A true nosebleed if I did say so myself," he told him. "Or maybe I'll start with the eyes. Ripping them out with my teeth is always fun to do." He shuddered pleasantly at the thought of it. Katsuki was staring at him with a new kind of horror. Katsuki hadn't noticed it before, but now that he has, he can't unsee it. The crimson color of Izuku's eyes, and his obvious hard-on. Following Katsuki's line of sight, Izuku's smile became a little softer. "Don't you worry about that. I don't plan to violate you," he bent down to whisper in his ear, the one that was torn. "As much fun as it would be to see you break, I'd rather see you in other kinds of pain." Keeping the hand on his throat, Izuku moved his other hand down to Katsuki's wrist. "Like maybe the feeling of your most useful assets being cut away from your reach." He dug his nails into his wrists, giggling childishly as Katsuki gasped in pain. The nails on his wrist grew sharper, cutting into the skin like it was paper. A scream tore its way out of Katsuki's throat, despite him attempting to stifle it. Ecstasy flooded Izuku's veins as he watched his revenge unfold. As Izuku severed the wrist from the hand, Shadow appeared from the shadows to cauterize the wound in order to keep Katsuki from bleeding out. Izuku took the hand that had been severed and ate it slowly, all while staring Katsuki dead in the eyes. Izuku strolled over to and around Katsuki. He got up to his neck, letting delicate fingers run along the nape of Katsuki's neck. Said boy shivered as primal terror raced its way up his spine. Izuku let his eyes roam until he spotted Katsuki's other hand gripping the arm of the chair. Izuku smirked and smashed his hand onto Katsuki's, breaking several bones in the boy's hand. He screamed out as more pain flooded his system. Suddenly, the wall was blasted inwards, and in came a giant boot. A white blur sped past it and directly towards Izuku. He had no time to dodge, so he found himself pinned to the wall. Maruko had a thunderous look on her face as he held him by the head. She was pushing so hard that his head dug a small crater into the concrete wall. TCH. Izuku couldn't say any more as his head was pressed further into the wall. Maruko gestured for the other heroes. Each of them, Edgeshot, Hawks, and Gang Orca, quickly approached Quicklash, aiming to restrain him. Quicklash struggled under Maruko's grip. He pushed and jerked against her grip, and was only half successful. Even as he pushed her off, she used all her strength and concentration to keep him in place. That's why Maruko was caught off guard when a stream of blue flame came out of nowhere to rain down upon the heroes. This move allowed Quicklash to escape the rabbit hero's grip. Jumping back, away from the heroes, Izuku attempted to gain control of the situation. He looked over at Katsuki but saw that he was missing from his restraints. He growled lowly, PSS off that his prize was taken from his possession. "So, how'd you do it, HM?" he asked conversationally, like nothing was wrong. Maruko and the others glowered at him. "Ain't no way we're telling a FCK killer like you," Maruko shouted. As she did, she launched a kick in his direction, to which he rapidly dodged. He sported a smirk the whole time. Hawks then flew off to deal with Dabai, who he had been having a standoff with. That left them with one hero down and trying to restrain the supervillain. Maruko didn't relent in her attack. Izuku dodged blow after blow until Toga interfered mid-attack to try and throw the rabbit hero off. The multiple knives in Toga's hand did little to deter the rabbit hero. Even as Maruko endured many cuts all over her body, she's had worse. After a few more minutes of endless dodging, Toga finally garnered Maruko's entire attention. This left Izuku with his focus on Mount Lady, who hadn't been able to interfere without messing up. The rabbit hero. The others were doing their best to keep Izuku on his toes. Izuku sped towards the hero's foot, not transforming yet, but growing a little taller to try and knock Mount Lady off balance. He body slammed into her legs, making her stumble. He grew larger and sunk his teeth into her ankle. She cried out and bent down to swat him with her hand. Though successful in dislodging him, he brought a chunk of her leg with him. Now bleeding rapidly, Mount Lady stumbled up, speaking rapidly into her radio, calling for backup. Izuku cut her off as he fully transformed, towering over the hero. She struggled to keep him back from her, and was losing a lot of ground. As she was about to be overtaken, there was a loud ringing sound that made Izuku let go of the hero. Coming onto the scene, it was Present Mike, who looked majorly PSS off. "Oi fucker, this is the last FCK straw." The noise of the voice hero's yell was shrill and Izuku felt like his ears were being torn. He took this as his cue to retreat, knowing he couldn't win a fight of so many heroes at a time on his own. He needed all the backup he could get when the time came. And that time was getting close. As he retreated, the other members of the league followed after him, disappearing from the hero's grasp. Izuku was a bit relieved that he had the foresight to torture Katsuki in one of the league's warehouses rather than their home like he did with Naomasa. Izuku has gotten insight that the UA staff was planning something. Nezu, specifically. That's when Izuku decided he was going to up his game. He started making maps of each city in Japan. He was going to make his move with the Meta Liberation Army. He was going to push forward his connections with the Shai Hasekai. Despite their disturbing reputation, they're making quirk erasing bullets, and Izuku wants one. Why, for Kaken. It will be so much more delicious when he can't fight back with his quirk. After his little stunt, UAS defenses have increased tremendously. Izuku can barely discern any large masses of shadows within the campus. If anything, the lights outside UAS walls seem to be making shadows bigger than usual. An obvious trap set by Nezu. Nezu is a bit of a problem. According to his mother, Nezu was once a friend of the Khans, many years ago. That friendship ended fast and hard once. Nezu allied himself with the humans. After everything that was done to him, Nezu still chose those measly apes. Izuku was currently brooding in the living room of their home. He was sandwiched between Hitoshi and Shaodo, with the former being on his left, and the latter on his right. Shaodo put a hand on his shoulder and softly told him, "Hey, stop thinking about it for now. Let's just enjoy tonight." Hitoshi verbally agreed, and put one of his hands on Izuku's thigh. Izuku abruptly stood up. "No, I'm sorry. I have to start preparing for our war in Nezu's." He was about to walk away, when two hands clasped his. Hitoshi and Shaodo held either hand. "Whatever you want to do, we're in this together," Hitoshi said. "You better remember that when you're feeling overwhelmed," added Shaodo. Izuku beamed at them. He went upstairs and knocked on Tamura's door. "Tamu, I need to talk to you," he called out. He waited a moment and listened for the shuffling of footsteps, before the lock said and the door opened. Tamura looked at Izuku and commented, "Nice shirt." Izuku had forgotten what he was wearing and looked down. He was wearing pajama pants and a shirt that said t-shirt. He smiled boyishly. "Thank you." Tamura playfully rolled his eyes before going, "So what did you need?" Izuku took a deep breath and told him, "I need you to start investigating in the Meta Liberation Army." Tamura had a neutral expression. "Oh yeah, are things heating up with your player too?" Not getting a response was a good enough answer. Alrighty, he turned around and presumably started preparing. Izuku gave him the time, and walked down to the kitchen. He was about to sit down for a snack, when Kurogiri appeared. "Jurin has been kidnapped." Izuku whipped around, nearly stumbling over the stool. He blinked, his eyes widening. "OFCK. Really?" Kurogiri nodded and Izuku raced back up to Tamura's room. Skidding to a stop at the open doorway, "Tamu. Plans are moving further. Jurin's been taken." "What?" Tamura looked just as surprised as Izuku felt. The Meta Liberation Army had taken Jurin. There was no other group as big and as ballsy to do such a thing. Redistro was trying for something. He's 90% sure, anyway. Izuku ran his hand through his hair, not moving from his spot as he was slightly panicking at the turn of events. He didn't know which way to go. "Izuku." He turned and saw his boy standing in the hallway. They registered the panicked look on Izuku's face, before rushing to embrace him. Hitoshi nuzzled his cheek. "What's wrong?" Shaodo kept his hand on Izuku's shoulder. "You look scared." "You never look scared. You're always so fearless." Izuku sniffed, before, for the first time in a while, he started to genuinely cry. Both Hitoshi and Shaodo embraced him again. Hitoshi pulled his arm towards their bedroom. Inside, there were 3 big, comfy bean bags on the floor. That's where they sat. Izuku continued to cry, relishing in the privacy to do so. Shaodo and Hitoshi looked at each other, both of them lost, but wanting to help. Shaodo chilled his right hand and put a comforting hand on the back of Izuku's neck, cooling him off. Hitoshi started murmuring sweet nothings into Izuku's ear, and gently cupping his face. "It's okay not to be okay." Izuku sniffed. I just want to do everything right." Shaodo gave Izuku a sad smile. "I know from experience that it's impossible to do everything right. You mess up sometimes, or things don't go as planned. That's okay. Whatever ends up happening, you can go from there." Hitoshi kissed his cheek softly. "Let's just let Things play out by themselves for a little bit and then we see what happens. Izuku gave a small little laugh. Hitoshi's face turned a little more serious. What happened to make you so upset, Izu? Izuku sniffed again. Jiren was kidnapped. That startled his boys. But he wasn't done. I'm not exactly sure who did it, but I'm willing to guess it was the Meta Liberation Army. OFCK, Shadow cursed. Hitoshi shared the sentiment. What they didn't expect coming into villainy was having the League turn into something comparable to family. Jiren, despite being their broker, was included in that family as well. They needed to get on good terms with the MLA, but kidnapping Jiren is counterproductive. Izuku rubbed his eye. The most rational thing to do is to do something of a ransom. We tailor to what they want, and in turn they give us back Jiren ... or something along those lines. I don't have a solid plan yet. Shout OKS him again, and you don't need to right away. Just let us handle this for the rest of tonight, okay? Izuku nodded, letting them take control. Hitoshi and Shadow started murmuring to each other, making plans and setting goals. After about an hour and a half of this, they ran out of ideas. It started with a KS on the nose. Shadow had pecked Hitoshi, who had in turn KS him back. Then Izuku tried to get both of them on the nose. It sort of spiraled from there. Hitoshi had grabbed both his boyfriends by the shirt and tugged them towards himself. The three of them laughed as they all headbutt each other, stealing KS now and then. We should get a cat. Of course it was Hitoshi who suggested it. Izuku giggled. Do we not act enough like cats for you, Toshi? Hitoshi fake scowled. You can never have too many cats, Izu. I wouldn't be opposed to one, pitched in Shadow. Izuku giggled. Maybe it will do us good. To add to our family, we can put on convincing disguises to go to a shelter and adopt one. Hitoshi smiled, his face lighting up at Izuku's declaration. For the rest of the night, the three of them just basked in each other's presences, and daydreamed about cute silly little goals they wanted to complete that had nothing to do with their main goal. The next morning is when they got down to business. The Meta Liberation Army is about to learn what it's like to be hunted. Izuku started doing all sorts of research. Looking through books, he found Destro's book. Reading it, he understood their views better. So now he knew where to look. At least he thought so. Any information he thought was related to the MLA, it turned out to be a dead end. They hid themselves well. It was researching a lead that another one turned up. A more concrete one. It showed up at the All Might statue. He's lucky he was prowling the area and saw a figure sitting on the statue. By the time he went to investigate, a finger was left behind. It was one of Jiren's fingers. He knows this because he sniffed it, wondering if he could eat it. When he recognized the smell, a wave of anger swept through him. Izuku started digging harder, searching every platform he could find. He used his status as the new boogeyman of the underground to gain some of his sources. While he was looking, he was also trying to figure out a way to get into UA. Nezu knew about the cons. Not necessarily their weaknesses, but rather some of their abilities. The ability to travel through shadows is one of them. Looking for a way in, Izuku found that Nezu had done his best to light up every crevice of the campus, which was a rather impressive feat, considering the size of UA. Unlucky for them, the League of Villains had more than 2 moles in the school. It's especially lucky that Takoyami's quirk focuses so much on darkness. Because of that, there was always a shadow in the premises. They weren't going to use this advantage quite yet. It was too early. That being said, one of the perks of traveling through shadow is that a con can take one non-con with them. It's how Izuku managed to get Hawks into their base. The goal now, besides gaining access to the MLA, was to capture Jiru Kyoka. This will be difficult, considering her quirk and the state of UA. But Izuku wants to torture her for ratting Hitoshi out as the mole. He wants to make it long and slow. As he was scheming, he got a text on his phone. Whack-a-mole. 8:34 p.m. Crow, Gremlin, I need to talk to you. SS Gremlin, okay, except I can't exactly get to you without giving myself away. Genesis, have you tried staying within Dark Shadow and communicating that way? SS Gremlin, no I haven't. I can try it. The perpetrator, am I still allowed on this chat? Citrus, I'd say you are, considering you were here at one point. SS Gremlin, Crow, I hate to ask, but could I meet in your dorm room? Crow, yes, I understand that it is out of normal reach of everyone else. Viz, Gremlin, have I mentioned that you're a lot less threatening over text? SS Gremlin, thanks, I think. Viz, you're welcome. SS Gremlin, I'll tell you all this. I deliberately try to be as threatening as possible in person. So there's that. Cheese, that makes a lot of sense. SS Gremlin, it kinda comes with the reputation. Genesis, didn't that reputation come from somewhere? SS Gremlin, well, yes. I am that threatening in person, but I usually try extra hard to do so. Zuko, I think you're plenty threatening. Gremlin lesser than 3. SS Gremlin, thank you S1. Crow, I'd like that talk to be sooner rather than later. Earlobes is not in the building right now. SS Gremlin, yes. Okay, we can try Genesis' idea. Izuku put his phone in his pocket, before he walked to where the desk in his bedroom was. Said desk was the biggest causation of shadow in his room, and that's where he'd go from. He stepped in, and the world went black. He could judge large distances pretty well, having had a lot of practice. In the direction of UA, there was no spots of shadow. Except one. He leapt toward it, and looked around before he hopped out. Yes, it was indeed Takoyami's dark shadow. He rose out of the shadows and into dark shadow. Takoyami-kun, can you hear me? Takoyami jolted a little bit, before responding quietly, yes, Gremlin, I can. Though it feels like you're talking in my mind. All right, good. Hopefully that means no one else can hear us. Yes, I believe so. To start things off, our trackers are in our necks. They injected them using some sort of advanced technology. Okay, then we'll need shadow as we dig the tracker out of her neck. At Takoyami's blank look, Izuku elaborated, to cauterize the wound so she doesn't bleed out. He tilted his head, which in turn tilted Dark Shadow's head. This place is a fortress right now. Is there anything else you need? I can't stay here for long. Takoyami looked hesitant, before he blurted, when the time comes, can you turn me into a demon of old? That kind of caught Izuku off guard, but he didn't see any problem with it. He circled around Takoyami, leading Dark Shadow in circles. Are you sure that's what you want? You can never go back if you choose that route. Takoyami just nodded. I'm sure. If that route grants me safety as you cast your rule, then I'll go down it. Takoyami, it's Uraraka, could I come talk to you for a moment? Both Izuku and Takoyami made eye contact, before Takoyami felt Izuku's presence leave Dark Shadow. Yes, Uraraka, you may come in. When the door opened, Uraraka Achako came in. She sat down on the floor in front of Takoyami, right across from him, where he was also sitting on the floor. There were bags under her eyes, probably from a lack of sleep. She wouldn't be the only one. She huffed an exhausted breath. I'm just here to check up on you. I've been checking up on everyone I can. Ada can't do as much anymore, but he refuses to quit. He's going to have surgery soon for his neck, and I want to help him however I can. The bird-headed boy grasped Uraraka's hands. I assure you, you are doing so much, and we all appreciate it in these tough times. Uraraka started to tear up a little. With all might gone, how can we keep up the morale? He was a beacon of hope, and we need someone like him to look up to. Takoyami looked down at his carpet, before he looked back up at the crying girl. What if you could be that beacon? You've made it this far, and everyone already looks up to you anyway. She sniffled, before smiling and tackling him in a hug. Thanks, Takoyami-kun. I knew I could come to you about something like this. I'm gonna go check up on some more people. She stood up and used her arms to wipe her tears away. Adopting a determined look, she made her way out of the door, waving goodbye to him on her way out. Takoyami sat with the weight of his two different conversations. Of course he feels bad about the people he's come to care about, but he's seen the scale of Izuku's plans, and it was either join or be killed. He can only hope that these people can see that what they're doing is futile. Izuku hasn't really felt like himself lately. Too diplomatic, too treacherous, too mean. He wanted some katsudon. He went down from his room to the kitchen and politely asked Kurogiri to make him some. Kurogiri blinked at him, eyeing his Eraserhead-themed pajamas and his Maruko plushie, before nodding and preparing the ingredients. He sat at the bar, relishing in the domesticity of the scene. He rested his head in his arms as he listened to the rhythmic chop of Kurogiri's knife. He thought about every time he stormed into this place, angry about something or another. He took the remote that was sitting on the counter and turned on the TV. The news was playing, as it always was. Izuku SWCH channels to a game show, something about knocking over a wall. He listened to the show, enjoying how carefree everyone seemed to be. He doesn't want to take away the simple pleasures of life. The carefree laughs, the joy of being with someone you love, or anything else that everyone in life deems as simple. He just wants to kill those who hurt him, and if that means ripping apart hero society piece by piece and rebuilding it anew, then so be it. He was enchanted by the heroes, once. Maybe if he still had that same naivety, he could have become something close to a hero. Welp, no use in dwelling in it now. He's not gonna get cold feet over something so simple. Before he knew it, a bowl of katsudon was placed in front of him. Thank you so much, Kurogiri-kun. He chirped. Kurogiri nodded, made himself a bowl, and sat down next to Izuku at the bar. He savored the flavor of the pork. It was lightly seasoned and had a teriyaki sauce drizzled over it. On the side of the cut slices was an arugula garnish that was dipped in a light vinaigrette. Kurogiri knew what he was doing. Izuku looked over at the misty bartender, watching him put the pieces of pork into the mist, where it disappeared. He wasn't sure if Kurogiri was actually eating it or if he was just going through the motions of eating while actually warping the food to some random place. Looking up at the TV, Izuku saw some sort of support item commercial. There was no audio, but there were subtitles. The man in the commercial was talking about individually manufactured items for those with meta abilities, otherwise known as quirks. The man announced that they were now making support items for heroes. It didn't take any time at all. Just about 45 seconds. Kurogiri, rewind it. The misty bartender did as he was told. Those with meta abilities. Izuku smirked. Bingo, he murmured to himself. He took his time to finish his katsudon, before thanking Kurogiri profusely for the food and going to his room for research into Detnerat. As a whole, he found what he was looking for. He never would have found it had the president of the company not specified meta. There it was, the trace of the existence of the Meta Liberation Army. They had gotten careless. Izuku gathered the members of the league, and was assigning them roles, when Tamura got a message from his phone. Looking over his shoulder, Izuku gave a sinister smile as he read it. Let's see if you're worthy. Gigantomachia is waiting. Izuku started giggling, before it turned into full-on crazed laughter. The rest of the league held tension in their shoulders. Whenever Izuku laughed like that, it was usually good, but he was being truthful about being as threatening as possible in person. He craned his neck to look back at them, one eye wide and one eye squinted in a look of mad insanity. The wide smile on his face only intensified the look. I think our plan just solidified. His body shuddered, though he probably wasn't aware of it. He turned around to face them. He suddenly glitched, warping the fabric of reality around him. If the other UA traitors didn't know that Izuku was definitely SS Gremlin, they would have thought they were two different people. It made them feel a little better that he was being a little dramatic, though they wouldn't admit that to him. They're not sure if the warping of reality was intentional or not though. Izuku mellowed out for a second, enough to tell Tamura, "Give me a day, and we'll go from there." Tamura nodded, not willing to argue with him. That's kinda how he became the leader in the first place. He was too scary to argue with, and that was saying something coming from Tamura, whose middle name is practically sinister. "Izuku, come here," said Hitoshi. Izuku walked over to him in shadow. His sinister smile disappeared, and he instead looked like a puppy. The change gave everyone else whiplash, even though this happened often. "Yes, Hitoshi?" Izuku asked cutely. Hitoshi didn't say anything else, and instead captured Izuku in a KS. Dabai vocally mimicked gagging behind them, while Toga whispered, "Cute." Hitoshi let go of Izuku, before turning to his left and giving Shadow the same deep KS. Shadow responded by grabbing Hitoshi's butt. "Okay, that's enough of that." "Yes, keep going," Twice piped up. The two of them reluctantly separated. Shadow took his hand off of Shinsu's butt and interlocked hands with his two boyfriends. "Oh, it's cute, don't even deny it," Magni commented. "My eyes," Mustard groaned. Izuku stuck his tongue out at them. The group knew if Izuku was actually annoyed, they'd see it. "Group hug," Izuku exclaimed. He got some grumbles, but everyone complied. They all gathered together into one group amoeba, with Izuku in the center. Dipping his head, he whispered enough that everyone in the group would be able to hear, but no one outside would. "Hawks is a traitor, don't trust him." He got subtle nods in return, before everyone let go of the hug and went back to their respective seats. He clapped his hands and laughed happily. "All right everyone, I'm going to bed, don't blow this place up while I'm gone." He got a chorus of, "We won't," before he left the room. Izuku stood on a hill overlooking a stretch of rocky flat land. Gigantomachia. The creature resting on this land turned, making eye contact with Izuku. "Khanivore." Izuku gave a little smile. "Ah, so you know who I am." All for one wanted Shigaraki Tamura. Izuku smirked. "Well, he got me, instead." Most of the main league members stood behind him. "This isn't right." The giant man smashed the ground, shaking the earth violently beneath them. They were thrown backwards. Izuku dug his hands into the rock, which kept him in place. The doctor tried to give him a whole backstory or some sit on a radio that sat near them. Izuku listened with half an ear, making note of what he said. "He doesn't look like a very good present." Dabai lit up his hands. "Good eye, his loyalty is so strong he's in despair over all for one. So basically we gotta work hard and get him to like us." Dabai questioned, before shooting fire at the giant. It did nothing to him, as he charged toward Dabai. "It didn't work, Dabai-kun," Toga exclaimed. Gigantomachia continued charging, and Izuku grew to about half the size of the giant, to start off with. "I guess we gotta match him in size." Izuku let spikes go down his back, ripping the suit he was wearing. Not so fast." The radio off to the side set itself on. The doctor's voice permeated the clearing. The radio then shouted Makia in All for One's voice. What happened next was a bit of a blur. Something about a familiar feeling in his lungs, and then his eyes suddenly opened in the doctor's laboratory. "You think you're worthy of replacing All for One's successor? You think you're worthy of my devotion?" Izuku ran a hand through his hair. He took a breath before he started talking. "Shigaraki this, Shigaraki that. Tamura was but the next step, and he made the decision to pass leadership over to me. I gladly took it, and now you are going to put me through whatever trial you were going to set up for him." He eyed the multiple tanks filled with an unknown liquid and high-end Nomus. He's never really liked the Namu since one of them took his Hitoshi. The group of them were standing in a mass of shadows. He doesn't know if this was a mistake on the doctor's part, or just sheer ignorance. But now Izuku had control over the doctor's domain, and the man didn't even know it. Very well then. Right before they were set to teleport back, Izuku slipped himself into the shadows, noting the location of the lab, despite the doctor's measures against it. The depths of the Jaku General Hospital. Suddenly, they found themselves back in the clearing, where Gigantomachia continued to run rampant. Izuku scowled slightly and took a step forward, his form growing to match the giant's size. Gigantomachia paid it no mind and instead turned and charged headfirst at Izuku. The two of them butt heads, creating an impact that shook the ground, creating cracks where the force reverberated throughout the clearing. Izuku grew a little bigger, before going to slash at Gigantomachia. Despite being partly made of rock, Gigantomachia suffered some deep scratches. As Izuku rushed back in, he created gouges in the skin. The giant roared, but it didn't faze Izuku. The giant was too big and his voice too deep to be grating on Izuku's ears. The other members of the league were off to the side watching the two behemoths fight. "I see what you mean, Krusty," Dabai said. About what? Dabai just smirked, before pointing a scarred finger at the fight happening in front of them. The reason not to anger the boss. He dropped his arm and tilted his head to the right. He's warping the fabrics of reality, as we speak. And it was true. With every step Izuku took, the rocks clipped into each other, creating jagged formations that became bigger and bigger. Though unsure whether or not that was intentional, the group watched as Izuku picked one of the bigger ones up and threw them at the other giant's head. There was an audible thunk in the clearing as the hit clearly rattled Gigantomachus' skull. The giant stumbled, and was still for a moment, and then he roared as BLD spilled out of one of his eyes. He thrashed, whipping his body around in an attempt to get the jagged pieces of stone out of his eye. But the moment it glitched into the giant's head, the fight was over. Okay, uncle. Now get that shit out of him now. Izuku complied, going on all fours and roaring at the giant. The piece stuck in his head glitched out and onto the ground in a bloody mess. There was no visible wound on the head besides the hole where his eye was supposed to be. The radio was grumbling, "Yeah, I can fix it, but I mistakenly thought you wouldn't go that far. We'll take it from here." Upon returning to the base, after having worked out the details, Izuku got some news from their traitors. Whack-a-mole. 2:47 p.m. Genesis, Jiru Kyoka trusts me. She doesn't trust Kodakuji as much, thinking he uses his birds to spy. SS Gremlin, this is good information. How does it help us capture her? Genesis, I'll create a shadow in my room when she is in there with me. This might lead to me being uncovered as a traitor, so it has its risks. SS Gremlin, I think this far in our game, it's time for everyone to show our true colors. Citrus, does this include me, Aoyama and Takoyami as well? SS Gremlin, yes. Perpetrator, well. Perpetrator, do I finally get my prize or my prey? SS Gremlin, probably both, but which one would you prefer first? Perpetrator, my prize. SS Gremlin, you got it. Izuku went up to his room to get his robbery kit, equipped for espionage as well. He grabbed some extra equipment for the quirk usage he'll have to face. Izuku readied his pliers in one hand, and a dog whistle in the other. He felt the shadow open near Yamomo. Hitoshi and Shado were doing the other two traitors. Kurogiri was going to be used for Aizawa, because he'd be the hardest to capture. The other two ... well sure they'll put up a fight, but they're not too worried about it. Upon making through the shadow, he blew his dog whistle, making Jiru attempt to scream. She was unable to, as a thick gaudy muzzle wrapped around her face, with a lock and no key present. Her earlobes were tied into a bow tie, but were luckily unharmed. Good. Izuku hissed slightly at the bright light permeating the room. The obvious counteract against his shadows. They allowed for barely any shadows to be cast from the intensity of the light. He swiftly grabbed the girl's neck and delivered a blow to the back of her head. Jiru didn't immediately get knocked out. The fuzziness came to her in slow waves. Meanwhile, the white-hot hatred and deep-cut heartbreak as the love of her life cut her off in an act of treason, and villainy seared through her body and soul. She attempted to cry out again and jerk against the rough hands that grabbed her, but her consciousness was fading rapidly, and she knew this was the end for her. Her life included. As soon as the girl slumped, Izuku smiled wickedly and cast her away in shadow. This left Yamomo the opportunity to let out a sob or two before Izuku came back to transport her out of there. He thankfully didn't comment. Jiru Kyoka woke up in a chair. It was a blunt, metal chair, with edges so sudden they cut her when she pressed her hands down. Her hands and wrist were strapped to the arms of the chair, with no viable way to move her fingers. Looking up, she saw that the room she was in was dark, thanks to the black light shining down on her. There was a sharp pain in her neck. The pain of a burn mixed with the pain of being stabbed rang true to her. The boxes and tarps that surrounded her in the dust-ridden room did nothing to give her insight as to where she was. She tried to move her lobes, but she found that they were limp and unmovable. The reason behind this were in the cuffs holding her wrists down. Quirk-canceling cuffs. A rare support item found on the black market. She doesn't know how easy they are to come by, but she's sure the League of Villains has plenty more where that came from. The League of Villains, she thought. Momo was a part of them. Well, someone's awake, then. Her head jerked up, but it caused a searing pain to stretch through her neck as the wound there stretched. Why would there be a wound there anyway? There wasn't any. Oh no, her neck, her tracker. Yue won't be able to find her. Just realized it, didn't you? Izuku taunted. He suddenly was up in her face, cupping it with his hands. You're here because you reap what you sow. And I'll be doing the reaping here. He leaned back and wrote something down in a journal he had on the table near her. Hitoshi wanted all the details of her torture and murder, and who was he to say no? He snapped the book shut with one hand, gaze trailing over the shaking form of Jiru, who let off a plethora of tears. The muzzle was no longer present, although she still barely talked. Be bastard, she managed. She could feel the strain in her vocal cords as the small tears got bigger and bigger. Oh, BSDRD, I've heard that one many times. You'll have to do better than that, sweetheart. Walking up to her, he bent down and picked up one of her earlobes. He held it in between his thumb and forefinger before pinching them slowly together, successfully pinching the lobe and stretching the metal-like cartilage in either direction. This action flattened it slightly, though it kept its shape. Jiru's screams were like music to his ears. He giggled lightly, before moving his hand an inch to the right, his other hands holding up the whole lobe. He pinched down again and bent it farther. Now it was to the point where the skin won't grow over it anymore. If it attempted to heal, then there would still be metal cartilage wiring visible to the eye. Izuku hadn't expected this technique to work, and he was delighted that it did. Izuku let his body warp like it wanted to. His vision became clearer as more and more eyes opened. His budding laughter echoed throughout the room, and he mimicked skeletal hands gripping the sides of Jiru's face. His thumbs raked just under her eyeballs, leaving abrasions that made her eyes tear up. The black light in the room only accentuated the rows upon rows of white teeth that went on longer than they should have. His form grew, and he wrapped his thousands of teeth around Jiru's head. He lightly cut into her scalp, making small cuts where teeth were, formulated all around her head. He unlatched the teeth and instead wrapped a single mouthful of teeth around the thigh of Jiru's right leg. He bit down, his jaw strength going a bit overkill, and snapping Jiru's femur completely in half, no greenstick fractures or anything like that. The scream she let out was blood-curdling, yet she choked as BLD rushed into her throat as the cartilage there ripped to shreds. She was coughing and choking, yet still unbearably alive. And she would stay alive, through her sheer will and her inability to stop breathing just yet. The leg was delicious as he swallowed it, right after chewing it into large chunks that he promptly swallowed. Ing his lips, he reformed into a vaguely human shape. The BLD marring his face cemented there not being any possibility that Jiru was making it out of here alive. He put his mouth around the wound on her neck, SCK on the BLD from the hole. Even as he whispered, he knew she could hear. Your heart. I want it. I want it. It's mine. Pressing his hand onto her chest, right on top of the heart, Izuku had the side of her face with the BLD-stained tongue. But there's nothing more that I want, except your heart on a silver platter, where I can devour it while in front of your beloved teacher. Or better yet, feed it to him myself. Why you're crazy. Yep. Though you could probably figure that from the copious amounts of murder I've committed. Her delightful screams continued as he splattered BLD onto his face, digging his teeth into the girl's chest cavity. Her body jerked as she let out her final, most desperate scream. Izuku messily ate his lips and decided to be merciful. "Yae Momo," he called behind him. The girl came out from behind the boxes and laid eyes on Jiru. He pointed at Jiru, though he was facing Momo. "Say your goodbyes." Momo hastily bowed and thanked him, before running over to the dying girl. "Kyoka." Jiru lifted her head as much as she could, and Momo. "Why?" Momo had a stream of tears running down her face. "I'm sorry, I never meant for this to happen. I didn't know he was going to hurt you. Please forgive me." She ducked her head and sobbed. I would have stopped him if I could. Please don't hate me." Jiru smiled softly, any fight within her gone at the sight of Momo. "I don't. I could never hate you. I'll love why." She slumped as her heart finally stopped. "Kyoka." Momo herself slumped across the body, KS the dead girl's lips. "I apologize. I hadn't realized you had gotten attached." Momo just casted a look at Izuku, no hatred in her gaze. "No," she replied despondently, "I should have told you. This was my fault." He walked up to her. "I'm sorry, and I'm offering a hug. Would you care for one?" Momo stood up, BLD soaking her body, and embraced Izuku. She cried into his shoulder. Deep sobs escaped her, and Izuku just patted her back sympathetically. She eventually let go, and bowed deeply to him. "Thank you for your grace. I'll go work on our analytics." She turned around and walked out of the room, careful not to aggravate her own neck wound. Izuku turned to the dead hero student. He scooped out her heart and brought it into the next room over, the door opposite to the one Momo exited out of. The scraggly form of a man sat slumped in his chair. His hands and feet were similarly tied to the ones Jiru had. His neck had the same wound as the others. Aizawa looked up at Izuku, taking in the sight of him covered in BLD and holding a heart in his hand. These walls weren't soundproof, so he knew exactly what just went on in the other room. "You monster," Aizawa told him bitterly. The comment didn't faze Izuku, and he just waved the heart in front of the man's eyes. Aizawa leaned back the best he could. "Great, trying to turn me into one of your demons, I'm guessing. Who's your friend behind me?" Hitoshi, who stood out of his eyesight, laughed out loud. Izuku watched as Aizawa's rather morose look turned into something more fearful and heartbroken. These emotions weren't too terribly visible on the scruffy teacher, but Izuku had been working with the man for several months, and had picked up on some of his facial expressions. Hitoshi stepped forward to look Aizawa in the face. He had a rather soft look on his face, as opposed to the wicked smile he had often. His hand cupped the man's face. "I know you might see this as corruption, but just know this." His eyes turned magenta, the noise permeating the room. "I'm saving you." Hitoshi held out his hand, and Izuku placed Jiru's heart in it. "Your own student, how fitting." He bent down to whisper in Aizawa's ear. "You do your job just fine, you're not a failure. We're just better than you." He shoved the heart into the hero's mouth, his other hand keeping it open. Aizawa choked as he desperately tried to repel the fleshy substance from lips, let alone his throat. He failed. Aizawa gagged and coughed, the fist-sized heart forcing its way down his throat. Once swallowed, he leaned his head back and resisted the urge to cry. Izuku bit a deep gouge in his own arm, before going off to the side and shoving Aizawa's face into his arm. BLD flowed as it naturally does, and Aizawa forced his lips shut. Any BLD was spat out with vigor. Izuku tissed and forced open Aizawa's mouth with his other hand. This worked, but Aizawa was still refusing to swallow the BLD. Izuku contemplated for a brief moment, before he grew in size and let his eyes multiply again. The monstrosity he transformed into was indescribable to the human eye. Aizawa choked at the sight, then gulped. The BLD was swallowed. The hero grunted and groaned, his body jerking as it initially rejected the transformation. Aizawa felt like his insides were on fire, and the heat just kept rising. Izuku was about to reach his arm away, but that was before Aizawa latched his mouth on the wound, SCK the BLD from it as much as he could at a time. The heat in his body settled to a simmer that was still painful, but more manageable. He let go and Izuku pulled his arm back quickly. Aizawa sat there, slumped like a puppet with its strings cut. He stayed like that for more than a minute, and both Hitoshi and Izuku left him. They also noticed that the wound on his neck was gone. They would make good on this opportunity. It would be boring if the heroes just got annihilated. But they won't. They've got Nezu. But once this war starts, Nezu isn't going to last very long. Izuku will make sure of that. The following day, they tested Aizawa's limits. Izuku was a little surprised that the transformation went as hard as it did. It was violent and volatile. So unlike Neomasa's transformation, he'd have to research this in the midst of building his army. Standing in front of the chair, Izuku looked down at the scraggly man once more. He took the man by his neck, squeezing it slightly tighter than any human could handle. Aizawa didn't die, so he concluded that the transformation had worked. Lifting him up slightly off his chair, straining the man's restraints. You listen to me. I have some food for you, and you're going to eat whether you like it or not. It will be whoever I choose, and we'll see if you're strong enough to resist. Aizawa mumbled, FCK off. Izuku let go and snarled in the teacher's face. The man glowered back, idiot, you think I'd just give up so easily? You've got another thing coming. Aizawa tried activating his quirk, but the restraints kept him from doing so. Although Izuku was interested to see how the man's quirk had been amplified, he wasn't eager to see if upgrading it meant it'd finally work on them. Izuku stared at Aizawa for a few moments longer, before he spoke again, bring him in. The door opened, and Shadow walked in dragging a hero student by the collar. Mono Manito, quirk, copy. There was a noticeable bump on the back of his head, where he'd been brutally knocked out. Aizawa lurched forward, his face contorted in despair as he struggled with himself. Gah, Monoma, he yelled. The boy barely stirred. He was definitely out cold. Izuku had his lips at the thought of another hero student death under his belt. But he liked it better when the hero student was awake and coherent while he killed them. This will have to do for Aizawa. Shadow dropped the student on the floor in front of the hero. He stepped over the crumpled body and went over to give a long KS to Izuku. As they separated, Izuku waved over to Hitoshi, who also smothered Izuku with a KS. Bring them in, please, he told him. Hitoshi nodded, before giving Izuku another longer than average KS. He opened the door and gestured his head to the people on the other side. Toru walked in first. Aizawa wasn't surprised by this, not after the police station debacle. Next came Mina. Aizawa slumped, yet met her eyes. His intensity unnerved Mina, and she looked away first. Next came Aoyama, then Takoyami, then Yamomo. Really? All of you? Why, we were a family. Aizawa choked out. And we still can be, if you'll let us, responded Yamomo. Takoyami bowed to Aizawa, I merely joined for their protection. I know which way this war is going and I'd rather be on the winning side. Aizawa was barely holding himself together. Okay, he murmured, what do you need me to do? Izuku gave a softer smile than the previous ones. I need you to feast. Aizawa shook. I can't do it to him, he said, gesturing to Monoma. He may be annoying as hell, but he's practically family at this point. After all we've been through, please grant me this small mercy. Izuku breathed a deep sigh. Fine. I'll find you someone else. Aizawa broke down into relieved sobs. Thank you. Izuku huffed. Yeah, whatever. Turning, he left the room, while the others followed behind him. Once out of sight of the teacher, everyone dispersed to do their own things. The three of them walked up to their bedroom. Hitoshi caught Izuku in a KS again. But this time he didn't stop. Using a hand to grab Shadow by the collar, he pulled the half boy toward him and began KS him just as deeply. Shadow reciprocated, letting Hitoshi dominate the KS. Izuku laughed with joy, pulling both of them on either side of him to sit on the bed. He cuddled them, and they became one big lump of loving embraces. Shadow KS'd the side of Izuku's neck, and Hitoshi copied that action. Their sharp teeth left small abrasions on Izuku's neck, but Izuku was into it. Shadow ed the spot he bit into, before pressing his mouth against the mark and KS it some more. Hitoshi took his mouth off Izuku, and pressed his body against Shadow, getting there by climbing over to sit on Izuku's lap. Sitting there, Hitoshi felt Izuku press himself against him. This made Hitoshi shudder with lust. Hitoshi suddenly got up, before turning around and getting on his knees in front of Izuku. Hitoshi, what? He was cut off as Shadow KS his lips while Hitoshi unbuttoned his pants. Sensually rubbing Izuku's bulge, Hitoshi KS it, before pulling Izuku's PP out of its confines. Izuku gave a full body shudder as his PP was exposed to open air. Not wasting any time, Hitoshi put his mouth around the head. Izuku against Shadow's mouth, while Hitoshi lowered his lips down the length of Izuku, slowly swiping his tongue around it. Izuku bucked up into Hitoshi's mouth, making the purple-haired boy GG a little. Izuku reached down and tugged on Hitoshi's hair, petting it gently as Hitoshi bobbed his head up and down, getting lower each time. When he reached the base, with the whole of Izuku's PP in his mouth, Hitoshi worked his tongue faster, until he felt Izuku shudder and twitch. Shadow kept his hand on the back of Hitoshi's head as well, holding him down. Izuku's eyes rolled to the back of his head as he came down Hitoshi's throat with a muffled yell. Shadow bit down on Izuku's neck. Not enough to break skin, but definitely enough to leave a bruise. Hitoshi slurped every last drop he could get, before popping his mouth off of Izuku's PP. He made a self-satisfied noise, even as he took one hand and rubbed Shadow's own bulge sensually. Somewhere in the midst of Izuku's CLMX, Hitoshi had come as well, and all that was left was Shadow. Izuku hastily climbed over to face Shadow on his lap, unzipping his pants and taking Shadow in hand. Hitoshi got up onto the bed next to them, and used his hand to rub both of them against each other. Shadow let out a surprisingly loud mmm, and came from Hitoshi's hand jerking him off. The three of them laid there, cuddling with each other as Izuku gave a dopey smile. "That was fun, we should do it more often," he said. Shadow piped up, "Shouldn't we, SHH? Izuku put his hand to Shadow's mouth. "We can think about other things later. For now, just relax." Shadow and Hitoshi nodded in sync, as the three of them eventually fell asleep. The three of them woke up later that day. Izuku was the first to wake up, and he shook the other two awake, not wanting to just leave them there. He went out into the city of Musutafu. Izuku walked around with a simple disguise. There was no true need to disguise himself, having made his identity known to the general populace. But he didn't want people to run away from him on sight. He deliberately avoided the main police precinct, knowing that he scarred them enough as it is. It was quite funny to him, actually. Walking through the remains of downtown, he saw as the buildings he destroyed were slowly being rebuilt. Looking up, the sky was clear of any clouds or smoke. Hands in his pockets, Izuku enjoyed the scenery of a city park that remained unscathed. There were few people outside. Only those who were brave enough to venture outside, eased by the fact that he mostly only hunts at night. He walked into the park and took a moment to stand there, taking a deep breath to revel in the peace he felt at the sight of the birds in the trees. A bird landed on his head, either unaware of the monster under his skin, or simply not caring enough to stay away. Izuku hummed a nameless tune as he looked down the street at the other end of the park to see UA in all its glory, being the fortress that it was. Despite all the damage done to its inhabitants, Izuku was still a little envious that he couldn't go to school there. It would have been a dream come true. But then again, he wouldn't have had the opportunity for all the beautiful violence that went on upon its grounds. Thinking about where he wanted to go for his next victim, a couple walked up to him. "Hello. I know it's a little dangerous these days, but would you take our picture?" Izuku beamed at the two women. "Sure. This beautiful day makes me want to bring my boyfriends out here." He took one of the ladies' phones and snapped a few pictures of the two of them. "So cute," he said, as he handed the phone back to the woman. As they walked away, Izuku heard them talking to each other. "See, I told you strangers can be nice. I believe in the good of humanity that way." Izuku quietly giggled, agreeing with them. Sure, humanity is inherently good, but he wasn't human, so that didn't really apply to him. Still, Izuku decided to be nice, and to not kill them. They seemed like nice people, after all. He thought they should check the news more often though. Going out of the park, and waving the bird out of his hair, Izuku headed to Katsuki. As he got closer, he let the disguise fade away. People noticed this, and scrambled to get away from him. It was almost comical. Yet it was also inconvenient. He was trying to find a victim, after all. Upon reaching Katsuki, he opened the doors and walked inside. The place was bustling, more so than usual. Probably because of him, actually. With All Might's death, and that of multiple other heroes, the only thing these villains really needed to worry about was him. Izuku knew the moment people spotted him because they all quieted down. This annoyed him a little. While he enjoyed the attention, he didn't want it every time he came in here. As he looked around, making eye contact to those who dared to look, they turned away as he waved them off. Going up to the counter, Izuku ordered his usual sweet tea. Upon getting it for free, he went and found a free table. Finding a free table wasn't too terribly hard, since a lot of people were trying to give up their seats. He sat at one of the closer tables to the corner shadows, in case he needed to escape quickly. Sipping his sweet tea, Izuku eyed the crowd, searching for someone vulnerable. The place was packed with people, enough that each table had to be filled, despite the people sitting at said tables. So there were others at his table, all who were visibly sweating. He laughed, making all of them jump. He sipped his sweet tea, looking as if he didn't have a care in the world. "Anyone in here y'all don't like. I could take care of them for you," he told them. All 6 of them looked at each other, not daring to move a muscle. Finally, one of them seemed to have the bravery to move, and said, "Miyubai Jiraka. 2 tables to your right, silver and orange hair, you can't miss him." Izuku smiled as his eyes glowed crimson. All of them flinched. He took his last drink of tea, before standing on his chair and scanning the crowd. Finding the man they were describing, he disappeared from view, diving into the shadows and yanking the man from his beer. Reappearing in the room with Aizawa and the man, Miyubai, being held by the scruff, Izuku deposited him on the floor, holding him down with a foot before the villain could try anything. Aizawa was slumped. His hair obscured his face, and he was relaxed, most likely asleep. Eraserhead Izuku sing-songed, "I have a present for you. Wake up." The man did, looking up fearfully. He wasn't sleeping very hard. Hitoshi was present in the room, keeping a watchful eye on his former sensei. They hadn't fed him anything, so he was bound to be hungry. Izuku's hand morphed into a claw, and he swiped it across the back of his victim. This action made the hero's head shoot up. Eyes wide open, Aizawa struggled at the obvious urge he had. Hitoshi walked up and untied the man, but kept the cuffs on. The man looked like he was about to resist, until Izuku's eyes flashed, and he said, "Feast." The hero's eyes fogged up and he lunged forward and onto the victim. Izuku took his foot off the victim, laughing as Aizawa barely resisted, if at all. It was so much easier than Naomasa, who resisted everything Izuku said. The victim screamed, but it didn't affect Aizawa as Izuku thought it would. He tore out the man's neck, splattering BLD across his face and around the floor. Eraserhead grabbed the man's vocal cords and ripped them out so he would stop screaming. He took huge bites, as if he couldn't get enough at once. Making good headway into the body, Aizawa ripped out the man's cyst, tearing out each individual rib with a rip that would give chills to anyone Aizawa knew. He mouthed at the heart, but the lungs were in the way. Grabbing them with his teeth, he chewed them into ribbons before grabbing the heart with bloodied hands. He plopped the heart in his mouth, so unlike the first heart he swallowed. As soon as he transformed, he ripped himself away, suddenly horrified at what he'd done. He stared at his BLD-soaked hands in absolute horror. This action made him scream agonizingly. Izuku took the restraints and retied the man to his chair, leaving him in the body there. It was getting late, and he'd check on the hero tomorrow. It was later that day that Izuku walked up to Takoyami, who was standing in the kitchen. Izuku put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Takoyami-kun," said boy froze at being addressed like that. He whipped his head around to look at Izuku. "Izuku-kun." There was a serious look on Izuku's face that wasn't normally there, but that the others have been seeing on his face many times lately. "I've been meaning to talk to you for a little bit." Takoyami fully turned around to face Izuku, giving his full attention. He wouldn't dare give any less. Izuku stood up straighter, making direct eye contact. "Are you prepared to fulfill your end of the deal? Swear yourself to villainy." Izuku took his hand off his shoulder. "If you want to become a Khan, you're going to have to kill someone first." Takoyami visibly shuddered, before bowing his head and speaking in a low tone. "Yes, I understand, Izuku-kun. I knew this time would come, and have aptly prepared." This surprised Izuku. Really? He focused all his attention on Takoyami. The boy fumbled, I think so. "I don't believe it's something I can truly prepare for, but I have done my best." Izuku turned his back, Looking over his shoulder, he went, "Follow me." Takoyami did. As they walked, Izuku slowed down so that his hand was on Takoyami's shoulder. As they made their way down the hallway, it got darker, with less lights than he was used to. Suddenly, he blinked, and he was in a different place. When they finally stopped, they were in a room with a body in it. The person was alive, yet unconscious. Knowing what he had to do, Takoyami murmured, "Dark shadow." The entity appeared from the boy, and she commented, "Monoma seems to have found himself in an unfortunate situation." "Indeed he has," Izuku replied. "I'll be behind him so he can't see me. All he will see is you." Monoma Nito woke up in restraints. Sitting in a chair in front of him was Takoyami Fumikage, a student of Class 1A. "Takoyami-san, fancy meeting you here. Not that I know where here is. Does Aizawa know you're playing rescuer?" Monoma rambled. "And speaking of rescuing, can we get a move on? Don't want those villains to know you're here and all." Fumikage was solemn, as he always was in the face of being nervous, but this was different. "You think the villains haven't staked their location well? That they think I'm not here?" Fumikage walked closer to the bound Monoma. "They know very well that I'm here, in a secure location." He raised an eyebrow, and then his voice, "Where no one can hear you scream." The incomprehension on Monoma's face was relieving at first, until he realized that Monoma's blind trust in him hurt. He spat it out, in clear words. "I'm here to kill you, Monoma." Said boy's face scrunched in confusion before the weight of what Fumikage just said weighed down on him. "Oh," was the only thing he managed to say before Dark Shadow was burrowing herself down Monoma's throat. Monoma jerked, with muffled screams permeating the room. His eyes betrayed his terror, as Fumikage slipped a dagger out of his sleeve. Izuku walked over to Monoma, putting a hand on his shoulder, and coming into the boy's view from the side. "What is it like knowing you're going to die? By your own classmate, no less." Fumikage was shaking. His hand had turned white from how much he was gripping the dagger. He stood frozen, before suddenly jerking forward, swngng his arm in a wide strike and stabbing into the abdomen. Monoma choked on the BLD rushing up his throat even as Dark Shadow filled up his airways. The entity disappeared further into the depths of her victim's body. The body was starting to contort, the veins being unable to hold the quirked mass of shadow. Fumikage pulled the dagger out of Monoma's stomach, letting the massive BLD flow freely. He stabbed it back down, wedging the dagger in between his trachea and collarbone. Suddenly, the body exploded, and Monoma got one final agonized scream out before he became a mess of gore. A heartbeat rang in Fumikage's ears. His breathing was ragged. His body shook slightly as gore covered him from head to toe. He had his lips, getting viscera in his mouth. It didn't taste awful, just metallic. The smile coming from Izuku was hard to miss. He was already eating the gore off his hands. Knowing what came next, Fumikage let his boots squish over the organs decorating the ground. As he bent down to reach for the heart that was still beating rapidly in face of the trauma he didn't know it could endure without a brain or a system connected to it. Giving one last look to Izuku, Fumikage took the heart and dropped it into his mouth. He flinched at the taste, yet kept chewing, and it eventually made it down his throat. The heart continued to beat as it made its way down. Again, it wasn't terrible, but his body was also in shock. Izuku walked right up to him, getting a little in his personal space, before biting down hard on his own wrist, letting BLD flow freely. He didn't rush the boy. "Whenever you're ready, Fumikage-kun." He nodded, and kept nodding, trying to shake off his shock. It wasn't quite working, but he stepped forward. Izuku held up his arm for him to take. Fumikage did, and put his beaked mouth around the wound. His teeth dug into the skin as he slurped the BLD. As he slurped, the taste continued to get better as time went on. Until finally, it was a wonderful taste like no other he'd ever experienced. Fumikage kept breathing heavily as he let go. He felt a little uncomfortable in his own skin, like something wasn't right. He eventually realized that Dark Shadow had deactivated herself, covering him in more BLD. "Your quirk has been amplified, just so you know." Turning back to face Izuku, Fumikage cracked his neck, and tried to call out Dark Shadow. He didn't succeed, because the shadows audibly crackled and morphed into some unspeakable thing that he was not ready to face. Now that Fumikage focused on the attention that was on him from Izuku, it felt authoritative, like he needed to listen to whatever Izuku said. He found that the gore splayed out in front of him seemed more tantalizing by the second. Glancing at Izuku, the supervillain gestured to him. "Go ahead, feast, I'll give you some privacy if you need." Fumikage huffed a shaky breath. "That would be appreciated. Thanks, Izuku-kun." "It's no problem." Izuku walked away, slipping through the shadows back into the living room where Shadow was sitting, watching TV. Going over to sit practically on top of Shadow, Izuku saw that Shadow was watching the Nature Channel, looking at seals and walruses. "Does the seal remind you of someone, Shu?" Shadow gave a small little laugh. "Yeah, Toshi gives off those vibes. He's like a seal with a bucket, at least when it comes to cats. It's cute." "Shadow, what do you think about going to an animal shelter and actually getting a cat?" Shadow looked over Izuku's fluffy head. He answered honestly, "I think we'd scare the shit out of the workers. But hey, it's worth a shot, I suppose." Once Fumikage was left alone, via Izuku leaving through Shadow, he took the bloody dagger off of the chair Monoma had been restrained in. He had the blade. The sharp edge didn't cut his tongue like he thought it might. The taste of human BLD over his taste buds was like nothing he'd ever experienced. His hands were soaked, his entire body was. Fumikage took a severed arm and dug his beak into it. He couldn't stop once he started. He doesn't know where his morals went. It's like they just disappeared. Not giving it too much thought, he took a huge bite, severing the hand from the arm. It was so good. He could feel it. Dark Shadow wanted to play. She slowly unfurled from his back, making the shadows of the room grow longer by each passing second. "I feel so strange, Fumi." The monstrosity that appeared before him was nothing like the Dark Shadow that was usually there. She was sharper, incredibly so. Her eyes glowed, even in the lit room. Fumikage placed his hand on her head, and she seemed more solidified, like a creature on her own. She went down and scooped up a couple of organs that hadn't been completely ripped to pieces. Now he really was a creature of the dark, Fumikage supposed. Dark Shadow shared her feast with Fumikage. He was not as deranged as he thought he might be, but there was no denying his new thirst for human flesh. It would make keeping his family safe so much easier. But he knew he had to commit to the bit, even though it wasn't really a bit anymore. The thought of committing to villainy didn't make him as scared as he thought he should be. So after finishing the last of the dead hero student, he resolved to be the most infamous villain in recent history, bar Izuku and his boyfriends. Hitoshi came in and joined them a few hours later. The two of them pitched Izuku's idea to him, and he lit up like the sun. His joyful smile was infectious as he piled on top of the two other boys. The Nature Channel continued to play as the boys laughed together. Eventually, Izuku got up and took out a piece of paper from a nearby shelf. Nicking a pen from the kitchen counter, he started writing out his goals. Hitoshi looked over his shoulder while Shadow continued to watch TV. Izuku started making a plan, mumbling to himself. As he wrote it out, Hitoshi started making some interested noises, which attracted Shadow to look over Izuku's other shoulder. "Oh hey, that's a good plan, Zuku," Shadow said. Izuku beamed, before he started mumbling some more, writing out the details in a linear form. Okay, I think I've got something tangible here. I just need to make a few backup plans in case something goes wrong," Izuku said, holding the pen up to his mouth as he eyed the plan. "I think Takoyami-kun should head the attack. Make it test his loyalty." "All right, then let's get started," Hitoshi said. A few days later, the plan was solidified. First, Dabai and Tamira would cause a distraction in a different prefecture, making it clearly the work of the League of Villains. The goal for them was to destroy everything and cause a general mass havoc for the heroes to deal with. They would be fine, and if they were in danger, Hitoshi and Shadow would warp them out. Next, Hitoshi, Shadow, Izuku, and Takoyami would start on the roof of a larger hero agency. And there they were. They stood at the top of a skyscraper hero agency at about 10 p.m. The nighttime was making Takoyami antsy. He was the faux leader of this operation. Izuku was the mastermind behind it all, but it would give Takoyami the experience. All right, let's start. Dabai, Tamira, it's all you, Izuku said over a comm radio. Roger that, boss. All right, time to dust these NPCs. Izuku smiled as he directed Takoyami to start the assault after waiting a few minutes. Looking over the edge of the roof, Izuku saw all the active heroes leave the agency in the direction of Dabai and Tamira. Takoyami punched in the lock of the roof door, making the padlock break into smithereens. Upon opening the door, there was a staircase leading to the top floor. The four of them went down, and Izuku made his way to the stairwell, sliding down the railing all the way to the bottom floor. From there he made his way to the receptionist desk and cut the lady sitting there down with a swipe of his hand. BLD splattered all over the desk papers as she slumped where her neck was cut. She didn't have time to scream. After a few minutes, Hitoshi followed Izuku, and Shadow stayed with Takoyami. What they found was a corporate office layout with many people working the night shift diligently to get the extra hours in. Takoyami found the main light SWCH, and fed them all off. Darkness descended, and most of the people weren't really bothered by it, and kept working on their computers. Takoyami brought out Dark Shadow in the black of night. The moment she roared was the moment all hell broke loose as she covered the expanse of the room with darkness, wreaking havoc on anything physical in the room. Be it desk chairs, the cubicles, or the people. The violent darkness was more frightening than if they could see the carnage raining down upon them. The office workers had nowhere that was safe. He cut down one, severing their head from their shoulders. He cut down another, slicing them vertically in half. Takoyami could distantly hear his own quiet laughter. Soon, they were all dead, torn apart in one way or another, and Takoyami was running rampant, feasting on their corpses like a bird of prey. They went down to the next floor, through the stairwell. The lights were on in the stairwell, and that calmed Dark Shadow down enough for Takoyami to get his bearings. Shadow didn't like how echoey the stairwell was. He felt like they were practically announcing their presence. Since becoming a Khan, Takoyami's morals have been on the downhill. He only wanted carnage, and that worried him greatly. He wasn't going to dwell on it now, in the middle of an attack. But still, it was something to look at later. They made it to the next floor down, and turned off the lights. Meeting some resistance as a few office workers charged them with office supplies, they were dispatched quickly by Shadow, using his fire. The flames were large, and scorched the people as if they were touching the sun. By the time he was done, in the small bit of time it took, that floor of people were decimated into ash. Takoyami briefly flinched at the heat, before going down the next stairwell. Meanwhile, with Izuku and Hitoshi, they were in the midst of fighting the agency's numerous sidekicks. Izuku laughed in the face of their bravery and trying to take him down without the other heroes present. You'll never get away with this villain. Izuku laughed again, more manic this time. Geez, you heroes love saying that little phrase, don't you? He held out his hands as he went in for the kill. Plus, I already have. He took one hand and grabbed the sidekick's throat. It didn't take much force for their throat to be ripped apart. The BLD splattered against the tile floor. The sidekick was on the ground but not dead yet. Their hand twitched as they struggled to speak. Meteorike. Izuku snarled and used his foot to bash the sidekick's head in. He was given no time to eat the person, as another sidekick swung in with knives for hands. He blocked with his wrist, which wasn't pierced by the blades. The woman, upon seeing that her knives didn't do anything, jumped back and aimed a kick at Hitoshi. The kick hit his side, and knocked him back a few feet. Hey, that was rather rude, don't you think? Hitoshi said to her. The woman scoffed, hardly. Hitoshi smirked as the woman slumped, standing still as her eyes fell dull. Stay there, he ordered. Running up to her, he used one hand to slice deeply into her throat and punch her hard in the stomach. He felt his hold of her lift as she was sent flying backwards. Spittle flew out of her mouth and BLD rushed out of the incision in her throat. She didn't get up from her prone position. There were only 2 sidekicks on the second floor, but Izuku could hear more coming. He took his time to feast on the first one while Hitoshi feasted on the second one. He picked at the brains of the first sidekick, before he leaned down to take a bite. The flavor of the brain was different than that of the heart, yet it was delicious nonetheless. He heard the footsteps of the upper floor grow louder, and he quickly dug his teeth into the cess cavity. With his teeth as sharp as thinly cut diamonds, he was met with no resistance as he dug through the ribs and bit into the heart. Spikes grew out of his back, going all the way down to his tailbone and all the way up to his neck. His crimson eyes darted around the room, landing on Hitoshi, who had just eaten his heart. He grew differently than Izuku did, growing extra extremities and rows upon rows of teeth. The next 3 sidekicks ran in, yet one almost ran back out at the sight of Hitoshi, let alone Izuku. They grouped together, which was smart on their part, yet they didn't know who to go for first. Izuku decided that for him as he suddenly charged forward, morphing into himself and grabbing the torso of one, flailing the person around like a chew toy. One of the other 2 screamed, letting both their guards down, and allowing for Hitoshi to brush up against one of them. Her eyes fell dull as he ordered her to attack her comrade. The other sidekick, a young man, refrained from hitting her and only dodged her attacks. He was unsuccessful in completely dodging, as he gained lacerations all over his body from his comrade's WHB-like quirk. So focused on the woman, he missed as Hitoshi leaned down and bit the entire upper body of the man. Izuku grew bigger, snapping his jaws and swallowing the first of the 3 sidekicks. He went and did the same thing to the woman under Hitoshi's control. The 2 of them made their way up a few floors, decimating people in their wake, and leaving gallons of BLD everywhere they could see. It was on the walls, the floor, and the windows. By the time they made it halfway up the building, they met Shadow and Takoyami, who had just finished turning that floor into a bloodbath. Suddenly, the calm flared to life. "Boss, the heroes are headed your way. We've killed as many as we could, but they just keep coming." "All right, I guess that's our cue, folks. Let's go pick up our distractions and head home for the day." He got all nods of affirmation before Shadow grabbed Takoyami, who couldn't travel by shadow yet, and transported them back. Izuku and Hitoshi went to pick up Dabai and Tamura. Upon arriving, he saw that there was BLD on Tamura's head, yet the prefecture was decimated, as if his quirk had powered up. Buildings were destroyed, and cars were upheaved. They had really done a number on the place. There were still heroes around, but they weren't an issue. Izuku grabbed Tamura, and Hitoshi grabbed Dabai, before they hightailed it out of there, making it back to the living room of their base. Takoyami had apparently gone to shower, which made sense. Luckily, their living room was covered with plastic for this very reason, so as to not get BLD everywhere on the furniture. Izuku yawned, before letting everyone disperse and do their own thing, namely, getting the BLD and grime off of them. Tamura let Izuku know that his quirk did indeed power up, which changed the course of their plans a little bit. Izuku smiled and gave a bloody hug to Tamura, who didn't reject it like Izuku thought he might. "Get some rest, Tamu-chan." Yeah, I will." Upon seeing Tamura get a hug, Shadow went and gave Dabai a hug. Said man didn't refute it either, and Shadow also put a little frost on the man's burnt arms. "Thanks, Shadow. How about we get out some soba as a way to celebrate a job well done?" The way Shadow beamed made Izuku's heart melt a little, and it was obvious that Dabai was feeling the same way. They disappeared into the kitchen while Izuku went to take his own shower. Former hero student Takoyami Fumikage participates in a large-scale attack on Keystring Hero Agency with the League of Villains. Uraraka Achako didn't know what to do. She fidgeted with her hands in the living room of the dorm. The news had to be wrong. There's no way Takoyami would do anything like this. Participate in the utter destruction of a hero agency. Kill civilians who were just doing their jobs. Team up with the very villain that tore their class apart. Achako had never met such a kind-hearted soul as Takoyami. He was meant to be in the hero program, Achako had thought. His gentle nature had fooled everyone, apparently. With Aizawa-sensei still missing, as well as some of her classmates, Achako has had to fully step up into the role of leadership. It's what All Might would have done. It's what Nana would have done. And now Achako will live up to their legacy. Bakugo was still missing a hand, and Kaminari an arm. But that hadn't stopped them from becoming great heroes. And she won't stop until these horrific villains go behind bars. Tsuyu sat next to her, shock coloring her face as the both of them watched the footage captured through the security cameras. Though the lights had gone out, the cameras had a night vision mode. That made it easy to see the horrific details of Takoyami himself decimating rows upon rows of people. The gore itself was blurred, but Takoyami was not as he used his beak to pluck the organs out of the people. It got worse from there. Dark Shadow came out and overloaded the screen. But not before Todoroki Shadow came on screen, showing exactly who Takoyami was affiliated with. "Uraraka, a word if you would," came Vlad King's voice from the entryway. Achako nodded and stood up from where she was sitting on the couch. Walking over to Class 1B's teacher, she spoke. "Yes, Vlad-sensei." Vlad King had a serious look on his face. "The teachers and Nezu have made the ultimate decision to combine both Classes A and B, since Class 1A has become so small." Achako let out a little sigh of relief. "Oh good, I thought it was going to be some more bad news." Vlad King's hard expression softened, and he patted Achako on the shoulder. "You're doing good, kid, keep it up." Achako thanked him before excusing herself back to the living room. "How can he be so evil too? It's just like Shinsu and even Todoroki," she observed. Placing a hand on her chin, she thought about it. That being said, Takoyami was cannibalizing those people. I feel like we would have noticed if any one of them were a cannibal. Unless they were changed somehow, like a vampiric quirk, Tsuyu figured. Achako thought back to the time in the hallway where they found out about Hitoshi. His eyes had turned an unnatural shade of magenta, and he had a feral look about him. "That's it, Tsu." She whipped around to grab Tsuyu's shoulders. "That must be what happened. That means they're not themselves. But is there a way to change them back?" Tsuyu asked. Achako's face was grief-stricken for a moment. I don't know." Aizawa Shouta spit into the toilet after having thrown up what was left of the victim he was given. It was revolting, what they were making him do. Shouta couldn't handle it all. How some of his kids had defected to the villains, or how he himself had given up so easily. But he can't. He can't give up so easily. That will make it seem like the villains had already won. It's just, whenever Midoriya tells him to do something, he does it, no matter how horrific the act is. He can't seem to wrap his head around it. wondering what his other kids were up to. Shouta sobbed on the floor of the bathroom. For everything that has been done to him, and for all the things he will be forced to do. Getting up and flushing the toilet, Shouta washed his hands and looked at himself in the mirror. His scruff was getting out of hand, and the bags under his eyes were more profound than ever. He took a finger and felt the incisors in his mouth. They were sharp, and it was just a testament to how much he had already changed. Aizawa turned and opened the door to see Izuku, who had his hand up like he was about to knock. "Hey, just wanted to make sure you were doing okay." "Well, as okay as you can be," he laughed. It was a light-hearted, non-malicious act, but it still sent shivers up Aizawa's spine. Yeah, I'm fine," he deflected. Izuku tilted his head to the side, almost like a puppy would. "Are you sure? People have been using me as therapy even though I'm the source of most of their problems. I don't mind either way." "Yes, now get out of my way, kid." Izuku just laughed again, gaining a glint in his eye as he stepped to the side to let Aizawa out of the bathroom. "Bold of you to tell me what to do, Aizawa-kun." The man just shrugged as he went to the living room and flopped face down on the couch. Izuku had followed him, and couldn't help the next laugh that escaped him. That's when Iemoma walked into the room. She spotted Aizawa on the couch, and went to sit next to him. He wasn't taking up too much space, so there was even room for Izuku to sit. He did, and it was just the three of them on the couch. "So, Aizawa-sensei, how are you liking it so far?" Aizawa mumbled something into the pillow cushions. He lifted up his head to look at Iemomo. "Not as fun as you think it might be." "Well, I wouldn't exactly call it fun, but I'm getting things done, so I'm pretty content with it." Aizawa sat up and sat in his spot properly. He motioned for her to elaborate. She didn't give, and he should have figured that it wouldn't go as smoothly as he hoped. "Diamine," he uttered. Izuku was bored. Aizawa wasn't doing anything that warranted his attention, for now. He was just trying to get Iemomo to talk, and she wasn't making it very easy for him. He got up from his spot on the couch and warped out of the room, right into a news broadcasting station. The receptionist saw him and opened her mouth to scream. He was beside her in a second, covering her mouth with his hand. "SHH," he muttered in her ear. "I don't want to kill you, but screaming will make that decision for me." He smiled as she hurriedly nodded her head, and he let his hand off her mouth. She didn't scream and instead shook violently in terror. "Now, I'm here because I want a guest star on the news. Is that too much to ask?" He gave her a look of fake nervousness. "And no quirkless-sen. TT, that's not a problem." "Oh." He got up close to her face. "So you have heard of me. This is wonderful." He clapped his hands together as he leaned back, giving her room to breathe. With a shaky hand, she called the top floor, where the news was currently being streamed live. "I need the director FF for a moment." On the other end, Izuku could hear, "Patricia. What's wrong?" Side-eyeing the supervillain standing next to her, she shakily smiled to herself and said, "And nothing's wrong, Tim-san. I just have a G-guest who would like to air on the show tonight. He is very persistent, that he should be accommodated." She stuttered out. Izuku's smile did absolutely nothing to calm her nerves, and just made her even more scared. "All right, I'll get you Miyaki-kun." There was a shuffle of movement over the phone, before a new voice answered. "Patricia, you said there's a guest. What's their name?" the man asked. Izuku took the phone from Patricia's hand, and held it up to his ear. "Why, Miyaki-san, I'd be honored if you let me onto your show." "You know what, I'll head up right now. Thank you for agreeing," Izuku said. "Hey, wait a minute." Izuku hung up the phone without another word. Turning back to Patricia, he wondered to himself, to kill, or not to kill, him. Patricia shook in utter terror, leaning back as far away from Izuku as he would let her. Making up his mind, he smashed his hand onto hers, breaking many bones in her hand. She gasped, but didn't scream, remembering his threat from earlier. "Oh, no scream. Smart." He turned his back from the desk and headed over to the elevator. He waited a few moments after he pushed the button. A man with a name tag on was in the elevator when it opened. He smiled darkly and cut him down with his hand, slicing his neck and getting the elevator covered in BLD. The body crumpled like a sack of potatoes as he slammed against the inside of the elevator. Walking in, he pushed the button for the top floor. With the dead man in the elevator with him, he didn't stop to enjoy it, wanting to look as pristine as possible for his time on air. When the elevator door opened again, it was to the studio filled with people managing the news that was currently on air. As he stepped out of the elevator, the doors closed behind him. It was only his hand that was bloodied. "Miyaki-san, I'm here for my interview," he exclaimed. Said man walked around the corner, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Sir, we can't let just anyone." He froze as he made eye contact with Izuku. "Oh, sit." He stepped backward and made to run, but Izuku stopped that before it started. Launching himself at the man, he held him by the shirt. "Why don't you let me in, and you won't have to give up your life, hem." He got a hurried nod in response, and practically dragged Izuku over to the set, where people were filming. "And here we have a guest speaker who forced his way into the show. Please welcome." The woman stuttered as she read, "T the Soul Stealer." There was a collective gasp, as Izuku waltzed onto the set. "Well, look at this. All for me. I'm honored." He mockingly bowed, before looking at the camera directly and going, "It's only a matter of time before this country is mine. Just watch me, it'll be here before you know it." He snapped his fingers. Holding out his hands in a mad gesture of insanity, Izuku looked to the right to see his bloodied hand. holding that hand out, go against me, and you will most certainly die. He made a fist with the same hand, but join me, and I'll make sure you're on the winning side. He gave a mad laugh, fit for a supervillain. Turning around, he leapt at the interviewer, slicing their neck with his other hand. People started screaming, and that made the cameramen shut the cameras off, trying to stop the viewers from seeing anything more horrific than they already have. With a mad smile, Izuku dashed to the nearest person, slicing their neck like all the others. He bent down to SCK the BLD from their throat like a vampire. Behind him, a crew member attempted to bash Izuku's head in with the camera. The move was successful, however, as Izuku drank, he grew spikes down his back, impaling the attacker in the gut. Izuku jerked himself backwards to dislodge the person. Turning around slowly, he laughed at the person clutching their stomach. Jumping on top of them, he easily stopped their attempts to push Izuku off of them, and used both hands to rip off their head. He grew, his limbs stretching and his body gaining a sleek edge to it. He swallowed the person's head in one go, ing his lips as others gave out their last screams. He bent over once again, digging out the heart of the victim and swallowing it. The burst of flavor on his taste buds could never get old. Each time he did, he could feel himself only getting stronger. He ripped and tore the others in the studio, until he was left with only a bloody mess in his wake. Everyone who was in that room was dead or about to die. BLD soaked the set. It seeped into the carpets and the floors. Izuku couldn't be happier with the turnout. He warped back to the living room, where Aizawa and Yaemomo still sat. Yaemomo saw him covered in BLD and winced, flinching back a bit. Aizawa saw the BLD and stood up abruptly. What the hell did you do? He demanded. Izuku just shrugged and said, "Oh, nothing, just a little fun on my part." He laughed, and it was quite fun. Before Aizawa could say anything, Izuku left the room to go take a shower. Aizawa was faced with the dread that this would happen often, and he was letting innocent people die. He sat back down and slumped on the couch. Mina Ishida wasn't prepared for this to get so out of hand. She joined to follow Toru, and she was firm in that fact. However, she had only seen this villain once, initially, so when he reintroduced himself, she thought she knew about him. But she didn't. She brushed him off as he tried to introduce himself, so she didn't actually know which villain he was. She was watching the news late that night, and saw that station fearfully introduce the Soul Stealer. And for that moment, Mina was excited to see what the notorious villain finally looked like. In the next moment, her stomach dropped as Izuku waltzed onto the screen. Suddenly she was glad she joined him instead of going against him, especially as he made his declaration of essentially join or die. Izuku had come up to her yesterday, asking if she was going to commit to being a villain and not just a mole. She had said yes, but looking at herself, her acid, Mina knew she was selling her soul to the devil. As 13 had said all those months ago, quirks can kill as well as they can save. Mina found it in herself to use her quirk to protect Toru. And if that meant joining Izuku and leveling Japan, then so be it. She huffed out a breath, trying to fix the mess that her hair was. That was when Toru came in, and Mina smiled as they chatted together. Izuku stood in front of Retastro. After a week or two since his news broadcast, Retastro had reached out, calling Shigaraki's phone number and announcing himself. He had called and announced to them that the Meta Liberation Army had their eyes on the League of Villains. Literally, they had a satellite pinpointing their location. Well, I suppose that'll conclude our business for today, Izuku said. They had jumped through a lot of hoops to get here. Twice had magnified his quirk, as had Toga. They had decimated a city. Deka City, to be exact. The two leaders bowed their heads, not making contact with each other. It was 50,000 people that their league had decimated. Most of them had been civilians, unable to do anything, even as they HRNSS their quirks in a hope to destroy the League of Villains. Izuku had felt great gratification as he heard the hundreds and thousands of screams die out for good. BLD soaked the city. Waves of it flooded the streets as these people were crushed into mush. Izuku's arms and legs were covered in the stuff, which was part of the reason the two leaders didn't make contact with each other. The other being quirk-related. Indeed, Midoriya-san, it was a pleasure. Retastro ignored his subordinates as they very obviously disagreed with that statement. Having gotten a secure alliance out of this meeting, Izuku smiled and disappeared into the shadows after bidding them goodbye. He made it back to the base, where he found Hawks in the kitchen. The moment the hero laid eyes on Izuku, he froze. His wings visibly did as well. It'd be comical if ... Oh, who was he kidding? It was very funny looking. He cracked a smile followed by a small chuckle. This apparently gave way to the minute softening of Hawk's shoulders. The hero didn't let his guard down, but he cracked a wider smile and said, "Ah, Akatani. Or should I say Midoriya?" Izuku gave him a deadpan stare as he said, "Akatani is fine." Hawk shivered, before he smirked. "I just stopped on by because I figured I should let you know that the heroes have decided that you specifically should be captured dead or alive." Izuku smirked back, taking the winged hero off guard. "Good then. I guess they finally decided to take me seriously. Well, this is good news." A darker expression overtook his face. "In 6 months' time, Japan will be at its knees, and I'll be there on top." Hawk suddenly looked uncomfortable where he was standing. As Izuku crept closer, the man's body coiled in a ready position. "Me, Hawks. I was wondering." He grabbed one of the hero's longer feathers, circling it around in his hand. Hawks unknowingly held his breath as the monster crept closer. It took no time for the very same feather to stab through the hero's gut. Do you really know what it's like for your life to be compromised? Hawks choked out BLD before responding. You ask that like I have a choice in the matter. Izuku let out a loud laugh. You're right. Next time I'll ask. He put his hands up as he backed off, letting the hero tend to his wound. Hawks grunted in pain, though it didn't seem like too extreme of a wound. Smartly, the hero didn't remove the feather. Izuku's smirk bled from his face, instead replaced by an expression Hawks could tell was sadistic glee. How about you leave? Get your wounds cleaned up. He PP his head to the side. Wouldn't want Fumikage-kun to find you like this. That got Hawks' attention. Fumi's here, he demanded. What have you done with him? He attempted to take a step forward, but bent his head and clutched his wound as agony raced through him. Hawks, said man whipped his head up. There, at the other end of the room, was Fumikage himself. He was different though. Hawks couldn't pinpoint it. Fumikage stared him in the face, glancing down to focus his eyes on Hawks' wound. Fumi, I was so worried about you. I'd heard you'd gone missing, but I didn't realize that they've got you here, he said. Fumikage didn't move. Didn't say anything. Only standing there for several moments. But suddenly, he lunged, managing to get a sizable chunk out of Hawks' wound with his beak. Hawks gasped and screamed out in pain. He fell backwards onto the floor, the impact jarring him for a moment. Fumikage ate the meat like a wild animal, chewing into the tough muscle like it was some jerky. When he swallowed, he did so with a gulp. BLD coated his beak as he stared at the wound with want. Fumi, what the FCK? I wouldn't engage if I were you. Fumikage is pretty hungry. Izuku cut in, smile on his face. Hawks looked at the villain in disbelief. Hungry? You mean like hungry? As in what you did to the detective, kind of hungry. Izuku chuckled. Yes, indeed it is. Give Masa-kun my regards. Hawks looked ready to bolt as he started to see Fumikage in a different light. Fumi, don't do this. This isn't you. Fumikage continued to advance. I'm not me. Well, you may be right, Keigo-kun, he confessed. But it's too late now, and I chose this. So may the darkness swaddle your soul as you make your way into the abyss. He bowed his head, before he lunged onto the winged hero's abdomen, tearing out another large chunk. Hawks screamed out, using his feathers to send at the bird-headed boy. Unfortunately, Hawks didn't have his full set of feathers at the moment. Just a few long ones and a lot of short ones. There was a long one stuck in his gut right now, and only one other one. Grabbing his last one, he sliced upward, catching Fumikage in the cest. It left a shallow cut, not nearly deep enough as it should be. Fumikage was mid-bite, and ripped another sizable chunk out. Now there was a gaping wound in Hawk's abdomen. Hawk struggled to make it to his feet. His knees crumpled as they failed to hold him. His wound, which was already gushing BLD, ripped itself open, bringing Hawk's head to the ground. BLD pulled onto the floor beneath him, only gathering mass. Fumikage advanced again, using his hands to grab Hawk's head and slam it down into his knee. The hero choked as he was knocked unconscious. He's all yours, Fumi, Izuku told him, not able to hide his smile. Right, the boy said. He bent down to the fallen hero, and tried his hand at ripping his wings off. He let the feathers fall as he held his breath. When the only movement Hawks made was flinching and shifting. Fumikage bent over the back wound and dug up the flesh from the ribs. The hero jerked, and Izuku held down his head with his foot. The bird-headed boy kept digging into the flesh, tearing out meaty bits until he got to the hole in the front side of his stomach. He stepped back and smiled as he looked at the gaping hole in the hero. The taste was exquisite on his tongue. He had his blood-stained hands, then noticed his tongue was longer and pointier. He looked at Izuku, who made a go-on motion with his hands. Fumikage lunged down at the number 2 hero. He tore large bites out of the man, growing an inch or two each time he swallowed. His contour shifted, warping even, in the shadows of the room. Izuku's own control of the shadows flexed itself. The shark-like smile of Izuku only spurred Fumikage's action of biting down hard enough to rip the heart out of his chest. The heart itself was beating very rapidly in adrenaline, despite being detached from the body. As he swallowed the heart in one go, barely even chewing, he grew sharper. His creature was different, with more spikes and horns. Less mouths too, but still more than the normal amount. He was about as large as the counter, and Izuku stopped him from growing anymore. Well, he started, I wasn't planning for the traitor to be dispatched so quickly, if I'm being honest. I was gonna go more for the psychological route while also hurting him. Izuku clapped his hands together. Alas, this moves our plans forward. I will gather us all together, explain the plan, and we will execute ahead of schedule. It was after Izuku cleaned up the kitchen that he called his mother. He explained what had happened, that Hawks had been killed, and he now had a time frame for when he needed the other cons. Once he put the phone down, Dabe walked into the room. Upon seeing the mop bucket full of BLD, he asked, "So who died this time?" Izuku beamed at him. It was Hawks. He shrugged. I wasn't really expecting it, to be honest. But it moves things forward, so I need you to gather everyone. Dabe rolled his eyes but complied. All right, I'll get to it then. He turned around and waved goodbye, ignoring the thing he came into the room for. Ni, Dabai. Before you leave, he had Dabai's attention. Do you want immunity from your flames? Make it so your skin doesn't cook every time you use your quirk. He asked slyly. Dabai turned back around, peering at Izuku's light expression. If you're proposing what I think you are, will it make me more powerful? enough to bring Endeavor to his knees. Izuku held out his hands on either side of him, as he tended to do, grinned and replied, "Oh definitely. You'll be plenty powerful. Your brother is a testament to that." Dabeyes grinned back at him, tore the stitches, holding his jaw together. "Good. I'll gather everyone and we'll figure things out from there." The scarred man turned around and walked out of the room. Izuku kept the grin on his face. His army was growing, one by one. Once the whole family was turned, there'd be nothing that would stop them. He'll just have to do a little convincing. He went and opened the door to the little backyard they had, which also included a drain for instances like this. He poured the bloody mop water down the drain. Leftover viscera and bones did not go down the drain, and he picked a bone up, taking a bite and chewing it like a dog would. The bone crunched under the pressure of his teeth, like it was a mere cracker. The marrow that flooded his taste buds had a taste unlike any other. He took another bite and savored it again. He hadn't really paid attention to the flavor, so caught up in other flavors for different parts of the human body. The heart was the best, with the brain coming in a close second. The spleen had a wonderful taste, as did the kidneys. The intestines were yucky and so were the lungs. But the bones, they were easy to eat, brittle like a celery stick. And the marrow within was suddenly coming in third place of the top human organs to eat list he had going. Regardless, in a few minutes, all the bones were gone, with Izuku having eaten them in a bit of a manic episode. He laughed to himself. Izuku left the remaining viscera for the crows to eat. No pun intended. Returning inside, Izuku found Shigaraki standing in the kitchen this time. "Hi, Tomu-chan," he greeted. Said man softly greeted him in return. "So," Izuku started, plopping down in the seat right next to him. There was no malice, just a friendliness rarely seen these days from Izuku. "I was wondering if you would like to," Izuku was trying to figure out how to phrase it right. "I mean, have you thought about becoming a con? It's your choice really, but I thought I'd propose the idea to you." Wow, his convincing was going great. Shigaraki looked up from his gaming console. He paused the game and gave his attention to Izuku. "So, you're asking to upgrade my character leveling. I don't think it's a bad idea, and I'm glad you're mentioning it now. Any earlier and I might have disagreed. But my quirk updated on its own, and I'd love to double that." Izuku beamed, happy with his answer. "I just have one condition," he continued. "Yeah?" Izuku asked. Shigaraki gave a smile that might have been creepy to anyone else. "I've seen what voice commands you have on other people who have been turned, and for the most part I just don't want it directed at me. I'll do what you ask, but not what you demand. Sound good?" "Yup, Tomu-chan." He gave the man a lil hug, before going into the living room, where he found Shadow asleep on the couch. Shigaraki went back to his game. Plopping down next to his boyfriend, he leaned his head on Shadow's shoulders. The half-and-half boy stirred in his sleep, but otherwise didn't move. Izuku lay there for several minutes. Shadow didn't wake up, and Izuku let him be, even as he got up. Stepping away from the couch and into its shadow, Izuku reappeared a few blocks away from Katsuki. He didn't put on any disguise, and he started to leisurely walk toward it. Not even one block in, he found a suitable victim. The sun was just fully setting, and the streetlights furred on as the night became darker. It was perfect for staying out of plain sight. The victim he chose was a girl who recognized him and had tried to run. He grabbed the collar of her shirt and pulled her back. "Please. I have a family," she cried. Izuku was confused. He tilted his head to the side and asked, "Why would I care that you reproduce?" The woman whimpered in horror, especially as he ripped into her shoulder. She tried to scream and call for help, but Izuku gripped her jaw, his hand inside her mouth. He harshly pulled down and to the right, ripping her jaw out of its socket, crunching the bone and leaving her unable to scream anymore. He put his mouth to her neck, his teeth breaking skin as if it were butter. He slurped on the BLD like he was dying of thirst. The woman's arms gripped him as she tried to push him away. It was futile. He was like an immovable wall. While he slurped, he made delicious noises as the woman started to shrivel. Before she could die from that, he let go and snapped her neck in one quick movement. Her body slumped as gravity pulled her weight down. He laughed softly as he got onto his knees and tore into her back with his teeth. The meat that tore away from her body was tender and flavorful. He pulled the meat from her rib, before tearing out her lungs with his hands. The lungs were often gross to eat, so he didn't. She was dead by now, so her heart had ceased beating. It was still plump and juicy though. Yanking it out, he stood up and, instead of swallowing it whole like he usually does, he held it in his hand and continued towards Katsuki. He ate it like it was a candied snack, small bite by small bite. The others that crossed his path either diverted out of the way, stopped and stared, or gagged and ran in the opposite direction. As he got closer to the hub, there weren't many places for these people, mostly villains at this point, to go. Izuku finished the heart, ing his fingers as the taste lingered on his tongue. There was a crowd around the restaurant, mostly just people meandering around. The regulars surrounding him wondered what kind of mood he was in as they saw him. But that was answered for them as he took the closest bystander and quickly slit their throat with just a swipe of his hand. The body fell to the ground with a thud. Some people scrambled back, and Izuku wasted no time in ripping out the innards of the victim, eating the brain, then the heart, then the bones. His laughter rang throughout the block. It was crazed and demented. He was living up to his reputation splendidly. Standing up from his crouched position, covered in others' BLD, Izuku couldn't be happier. As he made eye contact with others, they all backed away in fear. One of the newer villains tried to use their quirk to defend themselves. The fact that they activated it at all was practically a beacon for Izuku to target them. The quirk was some kind of shield, but Izuku just lunged and brute forced his way through it, shattering it like glass. The person screamed as their neck was grabbed and they were thrown to the ground. The force in which their head hit the pavement was so much that it made a rather sizable crater. If they weren't dead from the impact, then they were, as Izuku used his foot to bash their head in. Brains splattered across the concrete. He didn't bother with the brains, and instead ripped out the heart with his hand that had plunged through the cest easily. He swallowed it whole this time, and then stepped back to look at the surrounding villains. Each of them had different looks of fear on their faces. He gave a wide smile as he laughed aloud. He had all of their attention, and he said, projecting his voice, "Anyone else volunteer? I promise I'll make it slow and painful." He laughed crazily at his own joke. Most if not all of the other villains didn't know how to react. Usually Izuku was in a good mood when he came upon this place. While that's never usually been a good thing, he's never gone on a full rampage like he was now. There was no discrimination against his victims. It didn't matter the quirk, or the affiliation. The boogeymen of the underground wanted carnage, and lots of it. These people didn't know how to react, so most of them just ran. They scattered, trying to get as far away from this monster as possible. Izuku wasn't transforming, so he wasn't aiming for a mass wipeout, just individual kills. He leisurely walked towards Caterpillar. The people inside were largely unaware of what was happening outside, though they were getting some idea as people fled and Izuku approached. He grabbed one of the fleeing people and slammed them onto the ground. His skull stretched as he grew enough to decapitate the person. He then ate the heart and kept moving. Upon reaching the doors, he threw them open, making eye contact with the staff of the restaurant. He didn't touch them, knowing and appreciating their hospitality towards him. Everyone else was not safe though, and they watched him warily as he was covered head to toe with BLD. He went to the counter, ordered his sweet tea, and went and sat at the closest table to the door. As he finished it, he stood up and stretched like a cat. He stepped into the shadows and reappeared in the base. Shadow was now awake and sitting on the couch. He saw Izuku and stood up to give him a KS. It was bloody, but Shadow was obviously enjoying the BLD. They separated, and Izuku happily told Shadow what he just did. "I wish I could have joined you," Shadow said. "But I wanted to let you sleep." Izuku responded. Shadow laughed softly. "Thank you for letting me sleep then. I really needed it anyhow." "Hey boss, everyone's ready," Dabai came in and said. Izuku smiled. "Perfect." Everyone crowded together in the meeting room. It was everyone Izuku considered to be part of their family. An assortment of chairs were scattered around. Himiko cheerfully sat in one of the chairs, pretty close to where Izuku was standing. She looked eager to see what he had to say. Yamomo stood off to the side, not sitting, yet she was drinking a cup of tea. Toru sat in another chair. She wore a black full-body jumpsuit so that others could see her. She only did this in the base. Yuuga stood beside Yamomo, striking a pose and staring off into the distance. Izuku knew he had his attention. Mina was sitting close to Toru in a seat next to her. Shadow sat backward in a nearby chair, resting his head on the back of the chair. The two girls nearby were only slightly wary of his presence. Hitoshi stood nearby against the other wall, chatting amicably with Magni, who stood next to him. Mustard was playing a game on his SWCH, but looked up when he felt Izuku's aura permeate the room. Spinner, who was next to Mustard, was staring off into space, only snapping out of it when Izuku had walked into the room. Fumikage stood smack dab in the middle of the room, too restless to sit. His aura discomforted his former classmates. His attention had snapped directly to Izuku when he had entered. Dabai stood next to Izuku, in the doorway, his arms crossed. Tamura walked in behind Dabai, going off to sit in one of the front chairs. Izuku smiled at those who looked his way, which was most of them. "All right, I had Dabai gather us all together for me to announce that our plans are moving ahead of schedule." His eyes scanned each one of their faces. "I plan to terrorize Tokyo with an army of cons. I could give all of you a power-up, if you would let me. Fumikage here can guarantee it to be a smooth change. As Tamu-chan would say, leveling up your character stats." He got some mutters in response. Some were agreeing, some were iffy. But no one was outright disagreeing. If Aizawa were here, he'd be disagreeing. He wasn't officially part of the family yet, not being able to be trusted in regards to the heroes. Yamomo spoke up during the lull-in conversation. "I have made a steady alliance with the Gentle Criminal and La Brava, who have the skills to get into the deeper files of the Hero Commission. We can't reveal any location to them, yet they are trustworthy enough as mercenaries," she reported. Izuku hummed. "Good, that means we are closer to overthrowing the heroes." "Thank you, Yamomo-chan." Himiko raised her hand, speaking. "Your friends at the police station don't know anything about what Nezu is doing. Only Tsukachi-kun is privy to that information, and he spends most of his days at UA." Izuku held a finger to his chin, thinking. He looked back at Dabai, who spoke. "Overhaul is dead. Chronostasi's headed a coup, and now heads the Shai Hasekai. Luckily for us, Chronostasi's plans are more in line with ours. Their quirk erasing bullets are legit and being mass-produced." Izuku nodded. "Thank you, Dabai-kun. Izuku put his hands together and placed his head on his hands. To most, it would seem like he was praying. He wasn't. The others knew that well, having once asked him about it. He had replied that it was how he solidified plans in his head. All right, he said, after a few minutes had passed. My ultimate goal is to kill Nezu. Then, I want to level Japan and raise hell and anarchy. He put his fingers together childishly. I'm open to suggestions. Yamomo chuckled under her breath. What if we assassinate some government officials in important departments, specifically in the Hero Commission? She got some murmurs of agreement, while Izuku was in a thinking position again. I like it. So we can raise Japan from the ashes I'm going to create. Even as he laughed, he stood in the same place. Oh, this is going to be so fun. He turned around, facing the doorway. In 2 weeks' time, our plan will move forward. Let me go make the calls. He walked out of the room, leaving the others. Hitoshi walked over to Shadow, ruffled his hair, and went to sit next to Himiko. Zuku's really excited. I hope our plans go smoothly. Himiko smiled. Kui-kun is especially excited. I hope I can follow through with what he has planned for us. Her expression shifted into a similar expression to Izuku's usual one. Just think of all the juicy BLD I get to drink. Nearby, Shadow leaned up from laying his head on the chair, and got up. He went over and practically draped himself across Hitoshi's lap. We've also got to think of who we want to target. He ran his hand through his hair, messing up the perfect balance of red and white. While I would love to target Endeavor, Dabe already has dibs, and I've done enough damage to him as is. That being said, I think I'd like to target Present Mike, despite Aizawa-kun's attachment to him. That's a good idea, Shu. Hitoshi put a hand on his chin. I think I'd like to go after Ryukyu. She seems pretty formidable, he said. I'd like to go after Gang Orca. Twice piped in. The others started pitching their ideas on who to go after. They all agreed that they'd help Izuku with both Mount Lady and Maruko, who had it out for him. So, who wants to become a Khan first? Izuku's voice came from the doorway. Wow, those calls went fast, Mustard said. Izuku chuckled. Yeah, it didn't take too long. He checked his watch, 20 minutes. Not long at all, I'd say. Dabai spoke up. You can turn me, first. Like you said, I don't want my skin to keep cooking. Izuku's smile lit up the room. Great, follow me. He proceeded to turn around and walk out of the room. Izuku walked to one of their larger storage rooms. It was the same room he tortured Jiru in. Upon opening the door, Dabai was privy to the sight of multiple people tied up and gagged. There had to be at least 20 of them. When the door opened, all of them had made a cacophony of noise, as much as they could, to attract attention. At least they were all alive. For now. Oh, I didn't think any of you would want to get my attention. Which one of you is lucky enough to get my full attention? Izuku said, walking through the rows of people. He stopped at one person, and while everyone was gagged, they weren't BLNDFLD. That one person paled drastically, even in the black light. Izuku smiled, getting in the person's face. Enough that the person could see how sharp his teeth were. This one's good. What do you think, Dabai? Izuku turned to look at the scarred man. Dabai also looked a little pale, though he hid it well. This one is good, I suppose. Can I burn them? He asked. Izuku shrugged. Do whatever you want with them, just leave the heart intact. Dabai walked over and behind the person. He lit his hand up and put it on the person's face. The GG burned away and the person was able to scream. The screams were like music to Izuku's ears. Dabai only pulled his hand back once the person's face had melted. They kept screaming. Dabai moved his hand to about their sternum. He lit the fire hotter and burned a hole through their chest, right under the heart. Reaching into the guts of the person, his hand squelched against their organs. Upon finding the heart, which was still beating, Dabai pulled it out of the burnt insides. He looked over to Izuku for confirmation. The supervillain nodded and mimicked eating something. Looking a little nauseous, Dabai reached the bloodied hand holding the heart up to his mouth. He took a solid bite. Chewing, he gagged but eventually swallowed. Wow, that did not taste good at all, he commented. Izuku laughed, amused at his reaction. Alrighty, time for the fun part, Izuku said, clapping his hands together. He took his razor-sharp teeth and bit into his right forearm. BLD dripped down his arm from the puncture. He walked to be right next to Dabai, who took another, smaller, bite of the heart. He held his bleeding arm up to Dabai, who hesitantly took it, putting his mouth around the wound. Like a leech, Dabai couldn't make himself let go of the puncture wound. He could feel himself changing, though. His form became sharper, and he felt his skin thicken. Finally, after a few minutes, he made himself let go. He breathed heavily, closing his eyes as he let the foreign feeling wash over his being. Turning at the body, he looked at the heart in his hand. Taking another bite of the heart, it was unlike anything he'd ever tasted before. He supposed that was the point. Dabai didn't know what came over him, but soon the heart was gone from his hand. He had the BLD from his hand, before ignoring Izuku and eating the remains of the person he killed. His hands lit on fire, then his arms, then his shoulders. It didn't hurt, nor did it even tingle. Actually, it felt rather good, like a warm, soothing heat. He heard Izuku behind him. You get one more kill, and then you have to go find victims yourself. He remembered nodding, before everything was a bit of a blur. Before he knew it, Izuku had gone to the farther end of the room. Dabai continued feasting. Back with Izuku, said boy was toying with someone else who was bound and gagged. He took off the person's GG and let them talk. Please, don't kill me. I promise I don't taste good. I smoke cigarettes all day, every day. Izuku giggled. Oh, that's an easy fix. I just won't eat your lungs. They were never my favorite anyway. He put a finger on his chin and gave a little contemplative look. But what would you rather I eat? Your spleen will taste good, though I'm not gonna touch your liver. But of course your heart will taste delicious. So will your brain and your bones. Tapping his chin, he continued, I'd rather not have to deal with the intestines. And of course your BLD will be great. The person was shaking, and sweat dripped down their face. Why you're crazy. Izuku laughed again. Of course I am silly. One can't be sane to become the most wanted supervillain in Japan. He stopped right before he punched the person in the gut, tearing up their internal organs and making them cough out BLD. Please, no, they begged. Izuku looked over to where Dabai was still eating, and looked back at his victim. How about yes? He took their head in his hands, holding them in a faux gentle embrace. It was gentle until he started squeezing. Soon, the head was giving way under his strength. Their skull was being crushed and he laughed all the way through it. He didn't stop to their screams, nor when they died out. He only stopped when the head in his hands was a mess of skull and brains. He put the mess up to his mouth and took a solid bite. He slurped the brain like it was some noodles. The flavor was fantastic, and he enjoyed the crunchy bits of cranium in his bite. He held the crushed head in his hands while he ate it. He didn't set it down, and enjoyed the rich flavor of the brain. When the brain was all gone, he dropped the head with a splat, and moved down the body. He will admit that he ate the rest of the body like an animal, eating with large, sloppy bites as he got chunks of meat in his teeth. Once he ate the heart, he looked back over to Dabai, only to see a creature with a tattered cloak. Said creature stood up on 2 legs, each with an extra joint. The creature was still on fire, its blue flames lighting up the room like a beacon. It had a wolfish face, and its teeth gleamed from the flames. Dabai. The creature snapped to attention at the sound of his voice, before growling and shaking his head. Izuku let him resist, not seeing any harm in it. After a few minutes, the creature changed back into Dabai, who stumbled a little bit. Whoa, that was freaky, he said. Did you know that was going to happen? He asked. Izuku nodded. Yes, which is why I got 2 victims per person, plus an extra few for myself. Dabai rolled his eyes but didn't comment on that last bit. Well, I'm going back to the meeting room. I'll send in the next person. Okay. Dabai walked out of the room and down the hall to the meeting room. When he entered the room, Fumikage snapped his head up, while Hitoshi and Shadow casually looked his way. The rest of them were tense, and they didn't know why. Oi, Tamura, you're next. The boss is waiting for you. He jabbed his thumb over his shoulder in the direction of the storage room. Tamura nodded, before walking out of the room. When Tamura walked in, he wasn't exactly expecting about 24 people to be bound and gagged all in one room. And it looked like 3 of them were already dead. Done some damage, haven't we, Izuku? He said. Izuku perked up at the sound of his voice. Tamura spotted him across the room, bent over the corpse of one of the people. He was gorging himself on their organs, eating them with his hands and getting BLD everywhere. Tamura watched as he finished what was presumably the spleen. Looking up, Izuku beamed. Tamu-chan, you're here. Welcome. He hopped up, strolling over to one of the victims. To start us off, you can kill them however you want. Just don't touch their heart with your quirk. Tamura nodded. He wasn't really planning to use his quirk anyhow. It had become too powerful to use on a simple person, especially when he had used it to destroy cities. He slipped Fumikage's dagger out of his sleeve, and proceeded to carve into the torso of his victim with the dagger. He tore out the heart with his hand and took a solid bite. The taste of copper flooded his mouth. Before he had time to GG, he swallowed, and took another bite. After he swallowed that one, he said, all right, let's get this over with. Izuku continued to smile as he reopened the wound on his arm, which had scabbed over. Tamura put his mouth over the wound, trying to get as much in his mouth as possible. It was that same copper taste, until it turned sweet, unlike anything he'd ever tasted before. He pulled away, and turned his eyes onto the victim. BLD dripped from their body onto the floor, and their soulless eyes were cast onto the ceiling. He leaned forward, something in him compelling him to take his hands and put them inside the wound on the victim's chest. He ripped the skin off and put some of it into his mouth. Tamura, despite his frenzied state, didn't dare touch anything with all 5 fingers. So instead he just used his mouth to bite into the victim's neck, spurting BLD everywhere. He put the palms of his hands onto the back of the chair the victim was sitting in. SCK the BLD out like a vampire was heavily addicting. Tamura felt a little like a vampire, but less so as he moved down to bite down on the meat of the chest, digging into the ribs. He couldn't help the light that escaped him as he balled his hands into fists. He spread his feet shoulder-length apart, and they grew, as did the rest of him. Off to the side, Izuku watched as Tamura grew, similar to how he did. His shape warped into something indescribable to the human eye. The other victims surrounding him shrunk away from him as much as they could, even to the point of digging into their restraints. Izuku watched as Tamura gained feather-like appendages, one of his arms dropping to his side and morphing into razor-sharp talons. Izuku noticed that he had a beak, more than horns, kind of like the first Namu had. and similar to fumigage. All right, next victim, Izuku told him. Tamura didn't even stop to look at his victim, merely lunging to the side as he pounced on the being with the most life force in the surrounding area. It was a man, a few feet away, doing his best to stay silent, so as to not attract the beast. He failed. Tamura didn't stop to think about where to start, only lunging immediately. His mouth latched itself around the man's head, right before crunching down and getting bits of brain in his mouth. The sound was like a branch breaking from a tree, loud, with multiple points of splitting. He didn't bother chewing, just swallowing with ravenous vigor. He ate as something more than a mere wild animal, but instead like a limitless predator who's gone hungry for the last week and a half. For that's how long it's been since he leveled a city, taking the lives of the people there who were desperate to upend him. The victims' scream didn't last long, as they died and lost control of their ability to scream, their brain in pieces of long strands that were scattered upon the floor. BLD pooled across the 5-foot radius of the victim's body. Humans had so much BLD, coalesced into such a rigid form. No room for expansion, unlike Izuku, unlike Tamura, or unlike any other League member that's been turned. He made his way down the body, beak plucking out the vocal cords and the first of the spinal vertebrae in the neck. Then he ripped out the collarbones violently. As they clattered to the ground, ignored by Tamura, Izuku picked them up and started snacking on them. At that point, Tamura reached the heart, biting down on it like it was a ripe plum. His form shuddered, and his bones creaked. He gained another set of arms right underneath the original pair. His external obliques grew and feathery, taloned arms grew, so unlike human arms. But these arms were able to grab the body of the victim without any decay activating. Upon realizing this, Tamura grabbed the body and sat it upright from where it had slumped. He tore through the ribs with his teeth, crunching them like they were celery. Ripping out organs, Tamura feasted on them without care for any sort of preference. The liver, the spleen, the gallbladder. It was just the intestines that he didn't touch. Moving all down the body, Tamura looked positively horrifying to all of the humans in the vicinity. As Tamura finished up, he looked at Izuku, who radiated authority to him. Though Izuku held up his end of the deal and didn't even order him around, even to call his name, he didn't shy away from leaking his authority. The creature that was Tamura understood and stepped away from the corpse. It took a few minutes, but Tamura's extra features receded, leaving just the crusty man in its place. That was a lot of power-ups. Who knew you had it in you? Thanks, Izuku, for not ordering me to do your bidding and all. It was much appreciated. Tamura nodded at Izuku and walked out of the room, going to grab the next person. The next person that walked in was Himiko. She bounced right over to Izuku and didn't flinch whatsoever. In fact, she seemed to be drooling at the sight of all the BLD. It was a step in the right direction, anyhow. Himiko didn't need prompting as she stuck her fangs into the neck of the nearest person. The victim, who had not been facing them, yelped in surprise before they eventually screamed out. Himiko was having no trouble in draining the BLD of her victim. She pulled out one of her many knives and stabbed down into the chest of the victim. Scooping out the victim's heart, Himiko took a huge bite, letting the taste of the BLD override the strange fleshiness of the heart. She didn't eat any more than that one large bite, and instead went over to Izuku. Do your magic, Izuku-kun. Izuku huffed a laugh and held up his still bleeding arm to Himiko. She latched on and drank like there was no tomorrow. Nothing seemed to change at first, until her feet became padded and spikes went down her back. Her shape shifted to become more fox-like. Her fangs sharpened even further, and as she let go, she bent down onto her victim's body and feasted. Tearing through skin like it was paper, Himiko went through her first victim very quickly. Her second victim was dead in a flash, her fangs ripping out the second victim's heart at lightning speed. By the time she was done, she happily told Izuku, "That was fun, Kui-kun. Thank you for the yummy food." She skipped out of the room, going to get the next person. After a few minutes, in came Aoyama, who looked squeamish at the BLD that said the floors. Upon seeing the multitudes of broken bodies and the bound and gagged soon-to-be victims, he gagged himself, attempting to back out of the room. "Mon-ami, maybe I'm not cut out for this, quirkless-kun." Izuku was having none of that and appeared by his side in a flash, making the blonde-haired boy jump. "Don't be like that, Yuuga-kun, I can start some of it out for you." Here, he went to the nearest bound person and plunged his hand into the victim's chest, gripping their heart with his hand and yanking it out. Aoyama hid his face at the sight, especially when the heart was suddenly in front of his face, still beating in his hand. Izuku gave him a cute look. "Here you go, Yuuga-kun. Just take 2 bites and we can get this over with." His cute look did not match the situation, and it was throwing Aoyama off. He didn't take the heart but instead bit into it from Izuku's hand. Gagging but swallowing, he took another bite, repeating the same motions. Once Izuku got his arm up to Aoyama's face, it was pretty straightforward from there. Or at least it was, until after he let go from Izuku's arm, that he had a half meltdown. His mind was warring with his body, that is, until Izuku's eyes flashed red, and he ordered, "Yuuga, feast and be done with it." There was no questioning an order like that, and then things went smoothly. Aoyama didn't look that much different than him. After he was done, before Aoyama could go spiraling again in this room, he sent for the next person. The next person who happened to be Spinner. The number of people who were bound and gagged were rapidly dwindling, with each league member that came in. Spinner had looked like a drake, and it was actually pretty cool. Mustard grew spikes from his arms, and spores that channeled and preserved his mustard gas. Mina grew into a creature whose horns were coated in her acid, making anyone she rams into subject to an acidic poison. Yamomo was akin to Aoyama in that the sight of carnage made her a little queasy. She needed a little nudge as well. Izuku yanked out the heart of another victim, and it went smoothly from there. Yamomo grew talons on her feet and hands, her form shifting into something more beastly, like a lion or a tiger. Toru stood in the middle of the room, looking at the broken bodies of each victim. She steeled herself and used one of the knives that Himiko had given her to stab her way into her first victim. She didn't seem too interested in eating her kill. That is, until Izuku stood next to her, pressuring her into taking a bite of the heart she had carved out of her victim's chest. As she ate the heart and drank Izuku's BLD, the light refracting off of her began to shift, becoming brighter and warping the appearance of her surroundings. She remained invisible though. Magni was the last in, and she wasn't bothered too much by all the dead bodies, being wanted for murder herself. She ate her heart, drank Izuku's BLD, and transformed. Looking very similar to Izuku, she was quick to transform back. "Go get everyone, please," Izuku ordered. Magnets nodded, leaving the room. Hitoshi was the first to come in, having already been heading that direction. He got in and hung onto Izuku's shoulder, despite being taller than him. "Did you save one for me, Zuko?" Izuku beamed and nodded, pointing at one of the last alive victims. Hitoshi lunged, tearing off an arm and munching on it, ripping off the skin, chewing and swallowing it. He used two of his fingers on the person's atlas bone, pinching it to break under his force. The person screamed, right before they went limp. He ripped them out of their restraints and had them face down on the ground. He stood over them and crushed each of their vertebrae, one by one. He heard the others enter the room, and kept doing what he was doing. The person was whimpering, as that was probably the only sound they had the ability to make. Hitoshi heard Izuku say, "I saved one for you too, Shadow." Finishing up and eating the heart of his victim, Hitoshi looked over to where Shadow had lunged for his victim's throat, ripping out their vocal cords with his teeth. Izuku watched the both of them, just enjoying that he had all of his people in one place. He gathered them so that none of these dead bodies would go to waste, and that the cleanup would be easier.